What if Earth once carried a mind before ours and simply forgot? A mind that rose quietly, thinking in shapes and shadows, then drifted back into the deep places where memory dissolves. A civilization older than dust. A species erased not by fire, but by time's soft, patient hands. Wherever you are tonight, I'm glad you're here. Settle into the slow breathing of the dark. Let the world dim around the edges. Let the quiet become wide enough to hold the rest of this story. Because some possibilities do not shout. They whisper. They linger. They wait for someone half asleep to hear them. And this is one of those possibilities. There are questions that drift at the edge of understanding. Questions that do not demand answers, only silence. And among them lies one that feels older than the first tide. What if an earlier species rose and vanished before humans appeared, and the Earth, in all its vastness, simply forgot? If such a species ever lived, its story would not begin with fire or tools or the loudness of invention. It would begin with the long breath of the planet itself, a warmth rising beneath volcanic rain, a pulse hidden under drifting seas, a quiet awareness forming the way crystals form, slowly, patiently, without witnesses. Before continents found their shapes, before mountains delivered their first shadows across new oceans, the Earth was already practicing the art of forgetting, not deliberately, but because time moves in a way that memory cannot follow. Somewhere in that deep, unlit age, something might have stirred, not a creature as imagined in textbooks or painted in theories, but a presence, a mind carrying itself softly through a world still cooling. A species that learned to hear the low hum of the mantle, to read the slow gestures of tides that had not yet learned their rhythm. A species that rose not from competition or hunger, but from the planet's quiet invitation to notice itself. If they ever existed, their emergence would not echo in fossils or scatter clues across sediment. The world of that time was too young, too restless, too eager to reshape itself. Stone was still deciding what it meant to be stone. Oceans rearranged their borders as easily as a drifting thought. The crust breathed like a sleeping animal. Anything left behind, any trace of a hand, a thought, a dream, would be swallowed long before it could reach us. Yet imagine them for a moment. Not their bodies, not their shapes. Those are distractions worn by the waking mind. Imagine instead their awareness, soft like fog sliding across a valley that no longer exists. Curious, like rainwater tracing patterns no one will see. They might have looked upon the forming world and felt what all minds eventually feel, the gentle ache of being temporary. Their civilization, if such a word belongs to them, may have been woven not from stone or metal, but from the language of tides, the rhythm of shifting coastlines, the patient communication of forests newly born from cooling ground. They might have shaped nothing we would recognize. They might have written nothing we could decipher. Their entire world could have been made of memory, and memory dissolves. The Earth would not mourn their disappearance. It does not mourn in any way recognizable to us. Instead, it absorbs, it folds, it turns presence into pressure, pressure into heat, heat into new beginnings. And so this earlier species, this quiet intelligence that may or may not have ever walked the forming world, could have risen like a breath and vanished like one. The silence between those two moments might have lasted 1,000,000 years, or 100 million, long enough for continents to drift apart and crash into one another again, long enough for entire oceans to evaporate and return as storms, long enough for all evidence of their existence to be drawn downward into the mantle, where nothing remembers. But the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Time is too large, too fluid, too careless with its belongings. The Earth has lost more than it has kept. Entire mountain ranges forgotten. Rivers erased. Worlds layered beneath worlds. If something lived and thought before humanity, its traces would be fragments smaller than dust, carried in minerals older than sunlight, hidden in faults where continents whisper to each other. We would walk over their memories without knowing. We would breathe air stirred by forests they once watched rise. We would drink water shaped by rains they once heard falling on newborn seas. And, perhaps, in the quietest moments, a faint residue of their wandering still drifts through the atmosphere. Not knowledge, not language, not history, only longing, the soft echo of a thought that once belonged to another. For the earth tries to remember everything, but memory is heavy, and time keeps letting go. Somewhere beneath the crust, folded into the slow drift of plates, their story might still exist, compressed, distorted, unrecognizable, yet present, a forgotten warmth, a buried flicker. And if the planet ever dreamed, it might dream of them still, because no species vanishes completely, not if it once felt the shape of existence, not if it once looked toward a sky that did not yet know the moon, and wondered what waited beyond the horizon of its era. What rises leaves ripples, even if the surface later forgets, and the earth, patient as always, carries those ripples through every age that follows, even the age that would one day become ours. If such a species ever walked the young world, their beginnings would not resemble a spark. Sparks are loud things, sudden and bright, demanding attention. No, this older mind would have emerged the way a continent rises from the sea, slowly, unevenly, as if unsure whether to remain or return to the deep. The world then was different in ways almost impossible to feel from this side of time. Land existed in fragments, drifting like half-formed memories. The air carried the smell of minerals still deciding how to bond. Skies held storms that did not yet know restraint. Mountains were young and sharp, unsoftened by the patience of erosion. Everything was in motion, and motion is the enemy of remembrance. Yet, in that restless world, intelligence could still bloom. It could gather itself in quiet corners where chaos subsided, in warm shallows lit by a sun older than thought, in forests that rose overnight from cooling lava plains, in caverns where the heartbeat of the mantle echoed as a lullaby. Perhaps this species learned from the elements directly. Perhaps their first lessons came not from survival, but from listening. For the earth in its early ages was a teacher unlike any other. It taught through pressure, through heat, through patience measured in eras. If a mind learned to interpret those lessons, it could reach depths of understanding no later species would match. Imagine them standing, or moving, or flowing, for bodies are irrelevant here, beneath a sky still thick with the breath of volcanoes, aware of the planet's slow intentions. They might have sensed the drift of continents not as catastrophe, but as rhythm. They might have felt the deep vibration of tectonic plates, as easily as later beings would feel the wind. And so their intelligence may have grown, not outward, but inward. Not through tools, but through perception. A species like this would leave almost nothing behind. Thought does not fossilize. Awareness leaves no ruins. A civilization that never carved stone, never hardened clay, never sought permanence, would fade completely once its time passed. Time has always preferred soft endings. It lets them scatter without ceremony. If those ancient minds ever organized themselves, their society would not resemble ours. Ours rises from accumulation, of knowledge, of tools, of desire. Theirs might have risen from attunement, from learning to align themselves with the world's long breathing. They may have communicated in ways hidden from geology, exchanging meaning through the shifting patterns of water, the resonance of minerals, the color of light passing through mist. To us, it would look like nature. To them, it might have been language. They may have left messages encoded in nothing more durable than rain, instructions whispered into the direction of a river bend, memories folded into the bloom of a prehistoric sea, stories mapped onto the migration of heat through stone. Everything they built would have been temporary by design, offerings to the present moment rather than investments in the future. In such a world, extinction would not be tragedy, but return, not collapse, but dissolution. Perhaps they understood this from the beginning. Perhaps they knew that no species is meant to last forever, that intelligence is a visitor, not a ruler, that the planet allows minds to bloom and then gently invites them back into the quiet from which they came. If so, their disappearance might not have been sudden, it might have been gradual, a soft dimming across generations, a steady fading like the last warmth leaving a stone after sunset. They would have felt it first in the air, a subtle shift, a thinning of what once carried them. Then in the land, forests changing too quickly or too slowly, rivers forgetting their old paths, the world, as worlds do, turning into something else. And as their time unravelled, the earth continued to move, unconcerned with preserving the memory of those who once understood its language. Subduction consumed their landscapes. Mountains rose where their quiet sanctuaries once stood. Oceans claimed whatever remained. Nothing survived the transition, except perhaps the faintest impression, not on stone, but on time itself, because when intelligence rises, it alters the world in ways too subtle for fossils, too quiet for erosion, too delicate for our search. It shapes the flow of chance. It nudges the direction of rivers, the distribution of forests, the pattern of storms. Long after the species dissolves, those patterns echo. Some scientists call them coincidences. Some dismiss them entirely. But the earth carries everything it has ever held, even if only as a breath within deeper breaths. If this earlier species existed, its fingerprints would be everywhere and nowhere, smoothed by the ages until nothing of their story remained, except possibility. A possibility that flickers now, like the last ember in a forgotten fire, trying to warm a question too ancient to answer. If one listens closely, not with ears, but with whatever quiet sense awakens when the mind grows still, there are places on this planet that feel older than their stones, places where the air carries a heaviness, as if holding the last exhale of something that once stood there. Not a ghost, not a myth, just a memory caught in the texture of time. Such places are scattered across the world like fragments of a dream. Deserts where the wind sings the same note for 1,000 years. Cliffs carved by tides that vanished before mammals learned to walk. Valleys where the light appears to hesitate, as though unsure whether to reveal what came before. If an earlier species once watched the world from these places, their perspective would be unimaginable to us now. They would have lived in rhythms too slow for the human heart. They would have measured life not by years, but by the cycles of forests advancing and retreating, by the drifting of seas, by the rise and fall of temperatures older than language. To them, a century might have felt like a moment, and a moment might have held the weight of an era. When the world moves at such scales, the meaning of existence changes, what humans call progress. The carving of stone, the forging of metal, the building of cities would have felt disruptive, almost violent, to a species so attuned to the planet's gentlest shifts. They may have avoided permanence deliberately, seeing it as a refusal to accept the natural flow of things. Their dwellings might have been made of mist and leaf, constantly rebuilt, constantly dissolving. Their ideas expressed not in symbols, but in the arrangement of landscapes. A curve in a river, a clearing in a forest, a pattern of shadows cast at a particular time of year, all of it meaningful, all of it temporary. Civilizations like this leave behind no ruins, no monuments, no sharp lines for archaeologists to uncover. The earth does not preserve soft things. It only remembers what forces itself into stone. Everything else is carried away like pollen on wind, and yet the absence of evidence is not silence. It is a whisper. There are anomalies in the geological record, strange pockets where carbon lies in unexpected ratios, where isotopes burn faintly like dying memories, where minerals form patterns too deliberate to be purely accidental. Not clues, not proof, just places where the earth seems to hesitate, as though considering whether to reveal a story it buried long ago. Of course, the planet holds many mysteries. Most are natural. Some are coincidences. A few may be echoes of worlds lost beyond recognition. Imagine, then, the final centuries of this ancient species. Imagine them sensing the world, slipping away from the shape they understood. The skies shifting into colours that felt unfamiliar. New plants rising, old forests fading. Seas moving in ways they could no longer predict. The planet turning a page. Perhaps they tried to follow. Perhaps they tried to hold on. But the pulse of the earth changed, and their attunement, their greatest strength, became their undoing. When the land forgot their language, their thoughts dimmed. When the tides changed their rhythm, their memories loosened. When the air thickened with unfamiliar scents, their sense of belonging eroded like cliffs in rain. Extinction, for them, would not have come as disaster. It would have come as distance. a gradual drifting between a species and the world it once understood. A quiet farewell whispered across centuries. Not fear, not anguish, just a slow recognition that their time was ending. And so they would have faded, individuals becoming fewer, their gatherings becoming rare, their voices blending into the ambient hum of the planet. Then fewer still, then none. Long before humanity, long before even the earliest animals humans recognize as ancestors, the Earth would have already known the rise and passing of a mind capable of wonder. And yet, the Earth does not grieve in eras. It moves forward. The species dissolved into soil, into water, into stone, their last thoughts absorbed into the same deep processes that forged mountains and oceans. What remains is possibility, a faint imprint, a warmth buried so far beneath the crust that only time can feel it. And perhaps that is why the question lingers, not because of evidence, but because the planet feels lived in, as though something else once walked beside the forming mountains, gazed into newborn storms, and understood the world in ways we never will. The Earth tries to remember them, the way a dream tries to recall its first image. Not clearly, but with the ache of something meaningful, something nearly grasped. There are moments in the geological record where the world seems to pause, not in time, but in intention. Layers of sediment shift their texture, minerals change their pattern, isotopes cluster in arrangements that feel like the residue of thought, as though something once tried to speak through the architecture of stone. Most dismiss these as accidents of chemistry, the casual improvisations of a restless planet, and they may be, but even accidents carry echoes. Even chance holds memory. If an earlier species once lived, their presence would not be found in bones, but in disruptions so soft the Earth barely noticed them happening. A slight deviation in the flow of a river that persisted for a few million years. An unusual distribution of early forests that does not match climate models. A thinning of certain fossils during a time that should have been lush. Small things, forgettable things. But forgetting is how time preserves itself. Imagine, then, the way this species might have moved through the world, not as conquerors carving permanence from the landscape, but as wanderers following the quiet logic of the planet's unfolding. Their migrations would have mapped themselves onto coastlines that later sank beneath rising seas. Their gathering places would have been erased as continents bent and collided. Their shelters, if they ever made shelters, would have been woven from living things, taken back by the wind within a season. The world would have swallowed every trace of their existence, with the same ease that a desert swallows footprints before dawn. And yet, what makes their possible presence linger in imagination is not what they left behind, but what the Earth seems to carry as an unspoken ache. There is a loneliness in certain landscapes, a feeling not of emptiness, but of vacancy, as though something once listened there, with great attention, and that attention left an indentation, the way weight leaves an impression in sand. Stand in a basalt field where ancient lava once cooled, and the silence feels inhabited. Walk through a canyon carved long before mammals dreamt of standing upright, and the walls seem to watch with the patience of forgotten witnesses. Gaze across a tundra shaped by winds older than continents, and there is a sensation that someone once understood the language of cold, in a way no living creature now remembers. If an earlier intelligence existed, they might have been shaped by environments we can no longer imagine. Continents split into fractured archipelagos, oceans laced with minerals washed from newborn mountains, skies tinted with the vapor of distant eruptions. Their minds would have been moulded by forces, too slow for human meaning, too vast for human concern. What humans call survival, they might have called belonging. What humans call danger, they might have called transformation. What humans call extinction, they might have accepted as the natural cadence of existence. So when their era began to unravel, when the planet shifted into a form that no longer resonated with their being, they would not have resisted. They would have listened. They would have understood. Their decline would have resembled the gentle ebb of a tide. First, a few noticing the change. Then, many feeling it. Then the younger ones learning a world too different from the one their elders had once known. Slowly, imperceptibly, the thread connecting the species to the Earth's inner pulse would have thinned, Some may have wandered in search of places where the old resonance remained. Some may have waited, hoping the shift was temporary. Some may have simply dissolved into the rhythms of life, accepting the end the way forests accept winter. And if intelligence can fade, theirs faded with grace. Not a collapse, but a surrender. Once the last of them felt the final dissonance. Between their existence and the world's new shape, their story slipped beneath the surface of time, where even memory cannot follow. But here is the strange part. The earth feels different afterward, not emptier, but changed, as if something had passed through it and left behind a faint alteration in the texture of possibility. Perhaps that is why later species emerged, with an unusual spark, an unexpected curiosity, a tendency to look toward the horizon, as though remembering something they never lived. The planet had held a mind once, and though it forgot the details, it did not forget the possibility. It carried the echo forward, layer by layer, until the world was ready to let another species rise, one that would someday ask whether it was truly the first. And so the first imagined species drifts toward the edge of the story, not with a conclusion, not with an answer, but with the same quiet uncertainty that shaped their entire existence. Their world dissolves into the planet's deeper layers. Their era folds into stone. Whatever they once understood is carried downward, into pressures that erase shape, but not presence. Time smooths their memory, the way rivers smooth rock, turning edges into curves, curves into dust, dust into the soft haze that settles over forgotten places, just before dusk. If they ever walked the world, their final steps would echo only in the Earth's oldest dreams, dreams made of drifting continents, and shorelines no longer mapped, dreams in which a quiet intelligence rose like mist and disappeared the same way. Nothing of them remains in the strict sense, not in the ledgers of science, not in the fossils beneath our feet, not in the archives of stone, yet something lingers, a faint warmth beneath certain mountains, a strange calm in certain valleys, a resonance the mind cannot name, but feels, the way one feels a memory that does not belong to this life. Perhaps that is all the earth kept, not their language, not their form, but the softness of their wandering, a single delicate note carried forward through eras, waiting for another species to pick it up like a distant echo. And when the earth finally grew quiet enough for humans to emerge, when the skies cleared, when oceans settled into familiar heartbeats, when forests found their patient shapes, that old, forgotten note was still drifting through the air. Not a message, not a warning, just an echo, a leftover possibility, a gentle reminder that intelligence is never truly the beginning, nor the end. The species that came before, if they ever lived, left behind only this silence, a silence wide enough for others to rise within it, a silence that feels almost intentional, almost kind, and as their last traces slip beneath time's final threshold, the earth exhales once more, ready to turn its attention to the next chapter of its long, patient story. Because what the planet buries, it never fully forgets. It only stores in deeper places, and somewhere in those places, their memory waits, folded into silence, waiting for the world to remember how to listen. Before the earth carried familiar skies, before rivers learned their patient roots, there was a time when rain fell differently heavy, mineral-rich, warm with the breath of newborn oceans. And beneath that ancient rain, something may have listened, not a creature shaped in recognizable symmetry, not a being molded in the image of survival, but a mind awakening the way water awakens stone. Slowly, molecule by molecule, softening the boundaries between thought and world. If the earlier species ever existed, their consciousness would not have been forged by fire or hunger or fear. It would have taken shape beneath the first dependable rains, when the atmosphere thickened into a cradle and the world's long turbulence softened enough for awareness to settle into place. Imagine that rain falling on continents still warm from creation, hissing against volcanic plains, drawing steam from newborn forests. Every drop carried the story of the sky, the weight of minerals that had travelled through vents and storms, the memory of lightning that once tore open the dark. That rain touched everything, and perhaps, somewhere within that touch, a mind began to see, not with eyes, not with any sense we possess, but with a perception that rose from the very fabric of the world, a sensitivity to shifts in pressure, to the tremor of distant plates, to the soft pulse of heat moving beneath the crust. Intelligence, for them, might not have been a spark. It might have been a tide. Their awareness could have spread the way roots spread through soil, not reaching outward for conquest, but downward for connection. They might have felt the rhythm of the earth as intimately as later species felt their own heartbeat, the sound of rain on surfaces still deciding whether to become stone or soil might have been their first memory. And because their intelligence was born from the world's earliest weather, their thoughts may have carried the shifting textures of storms, ideas forming like low clouds rolling over a warm sea, understanding unfolding like mist caught between mountains, emotion drifting like early fogs across ancient valleys. Humans would have called it atmosphere. For them, it was identity. The first rain shaped their thinking, the way lullabies shape dreams. Its cadence may have been their earliest language, gentle, repeating, a pattern that soothed the restless ground. They may have sensed meaning in the intervals between droplets, in the sudden hush before a distant storm, in the way light bent inside a falling sheet of water. If they gathered anywhere, it would have been where rain met warm stone, where steam rose like memory returning to the sky. Those places would have felt sacred, not because they built temples, but because the world itself pulsed with recognition. And so their rise was not an event. It was a climate, a gradual alignment between the forming earth and the minds learning to read it. Their thoughts would have moved in slow arcs, long currents shaped by seasons older than any calendar. They would have pondered not moments, but eras, not changes, but cycles, not the fleeting, but the eternal returning. What humans would later call science, they might have felt intuitively, as one feels the approach of rain. Gravity would not have been a law, but a presence. Carbon, not an element, but a memory of things yet to be formed. The movement of stars, not a pattern, but a lullaby taught by the night. These were not beings who sought to catalogue the world. They listened to it. They leaned into it. They became fluent in its silences. And perhaps that is why nothing of them remains. A species that lived inside the breath of storms would not leave behind tools. A species shaped by rain would build nothing meant to last. Their architecture would be temporary as puddles, and just as meaningful. They would have trusted the world to remember, and the world did, just not in ways humans know how to read. Somewhere beneath layers of stone once softened by those ancient rains, there may still lie the resonance of their awareness, a faint alignment of minerals, a pattern in crystalline growth, a subtle echo in the chemical story of the atmosphere. The first rain carried them into being, and when the rains changed, they would have known their time was thinning. But that part of the story comes later. For now, imagine them beneath that early sky, listening to the world breathe, feeling thought ripple through the falling water, as gently as moonlight ripples through a quiet sea. In that rain, their minds were born. In that rain, their memories began to take shape. And in that rain, the earth felt intelligence stretch its limbs for the very first time. The rain did more than fall on them. It shaped them. It gave contour to their earliest thoughts, softening what was sharp, cooling what was restless, guiding their minds the way rivers guide valleys into being. Every drop carried a fragment of the planet's memory. Minerals lifted from deep chambers, vapors exhaled from volcanic throats, the breath of oceans stirring under half-formed moons. When the rain touched the ground, it released those memories back into the world, and perhaps those memories were the first things this ancient species learned to hear, not with ears, for ears belonged to the later creatures, the noisy ones. This earlier species sensed rain as a trembling in the air, a pattern in the shifting weight of atmosphere, a soft rearrangement of the world's intentions. Imagine them gathered in places where warm rains fell longest, settling into the low hum that formed when storm water met cooling stone. To them, that hum was not a sound, it was a pulse, a reassurance that the world was still speaking. still alive, still willing to share its unfolding mysteries. Their thoughts arose from that pulse, not in sharp bursts of insight, but in long, low waves that matched the movements of tides not yet bound by moonlight. If they ever spoke, their language would not have been carried on air. It would have been carried on humidity, a subtle variation in the density of mist, a gentle change in the rhythm of falling rain, meaning woven into patterns too soft for later species to perceive. Humans would have walked past their conversations and felt only weather. To this ancient species, intelligence was not something separate from the world. It was the world learning to notice itself. Their minds were not confined to bodies. Awareness drifted through them, like fog drifting through a forest of undisturbed trees. They may have had physical forms, but those forms were not their boundaries. As the rains continued for centuries upon centuries, their intelligence deepened. They began to anticipate storms, not by watching the sky, but by sensing the subtle changes in the Earth's breath. When distant volcanoes stirred, they felt the tremor like a memory returning. When the first long droughts arrived, they recognized them as shifts in the great dialogue between water and stone. Their understanding of time was unlike anything humans would later experience. Humans learned time through seasons. This earlier species learned time through cycles so vast, they could feel the world turning beneath them, like an animal shifting in its sleep. A single lifetime for them might have held the birth and fading of entire forests, the slow cooling of mountain ranges, the retreat and return of ancient seas. Their memories were long, but not in the way human memories are long. They did not preserve details or stories. They preserved patterns, the shape of a certain rainfall, the warmth of a particular wind, the weight of a sky before dawn. To lose such patterns would have felt like losing parts of themselves. But in those early ages, before climates learned to change too quickly, the world was generous. Rains returned. Seas were predictable. Forests grew according to rhythms that rarely betrayed them. Their intelligence blossomed in that stability. They traced the migration of moisture across continents. They followed the long drift of heat through stone. Their thoughts were woven from evaporation and condensation, from the endless rising and falling of water that had no reason yet to abandon them. There may have been moments when they sensed a deeper truth, that the rains which nourished them were not eternal, that climates were delicate structures, balanced on forces too immense to predict fully. But that understanding would have come softly as all things came to them. For now, they lived in an age of alignment, where the world's breath matched their own, and intelligence existed not as struggle, but as harmony. And then, gradually, the rains began to change. Not enough to alarm them, not enough to end them, just enough to stir a subtle shift in the rhythm they had always trusted. Storms wandered from their old paths. Clouds formed in unfamiliar shapes. Minerals dissolved into the rain that once fell pure and warm. At first, these were only curiosities, but curiosity was the first hint that change was stirring. They sensed the early signs, the way one senses approaching dusk, not as an ending, but as a soft rearrangement of light. They did not know it yet, but the rain that had carried their awakening was preparing to carry their fading as well. For all things shaped by water eventually learn that water never stays. The changing rains arrive slowly at first, as all great shifts do. Not in storms, but in whispers. Small abnormalities in the weight of mist, subtle hesitations in the clouds, patterns they had felt for ages, now arriving slightly out of place. For a species attuned to the breath of the earth, these were not warnings. They were questions. What had once been warm rain began to cool. What had fallen soft and predictable arrived with new minerals, strange metallic traces carried from mountains, still reshaping themselves under the pressure of newborn tectonics. The first rainfall of this new pattern must have struck them like a forgotten memory, unfamiliar, yet somehow inevitable. They gathered beneath it, the way one gathers beneath a change in song, listening not with fear, but with a deep, contemplative calm. For them, the world's shifts were sacred conversations. Every variation in rainfall held meaning, but meaning was changing, and so were they. The rains that shaped their thoughts now reshaped them again. Their intelligence, once a diffuse, drifting awareness, began to bend, subtly but undeniably, toward adaptation. Adaptation was unfamiliar to them. They had never needed it. The world had been stable for so long. That intelligence meant alignment, not adjustment. Now, the earth asked something new of them. The colder rains carried signals from distant places they had never touched, signals from glaciers forming on mountains that were once too warm to hold ice, signals from seas growing restless as new currents stirred beneath their surfaces, signals from the deep mantle shifting, pressing continents into new trajectories. They felt these changes as a quiet dissonance inside their awareness. The world's breath no longer matched their own. For the first time, their thoughts grew heavy. What had once been effortless, the sensing of cycles, the flowing with patterns, required attention, a strain, a searching. This was not decline, not yet. It was the earliest sensation of being out of place, in the very world that had shaped them. In the forests where warm rains once gathered on broad, steaming leaves, the new droplets fell with a sharper chill, damaging tender structures that had never learned to brace against cold. Streams shifted their mineral balance, altering the chemistry that had once aligned perfectly with the species' attuned perception. Their gatherings became quieter, not out of fear. They did not know fear, but out of contemplation, a deep, slow pondering of how the world had begun to tilt, away from the memory of its earlier self. Some of them followed the new rains, to higher lands, hoping the patterns there would resemble the ones they remembered from their emergence. But the heights carried different truths. Winds colder, soils younger, skies thinner. Others retreated to low valleys, seeking warmth in the steaming breaths of volcanic cradles. But even there, the earth's pulse felt altered, less steady, less familiar. Rain had been their first teacher, their first mirror, their first language. And now the lessons changed faster than they could translate. It was not that they failed to adapt. Their adaptation was profound, subtle, beautiful, but too slow. The Earth's new cycles were no longer measured in the comfortable rhythms they had known for ages. The ancient rains had moved like lullabies. The new ones moved like questions, with answers that drifted beyond reach. Their minds, shaped by long stability, could not chase cycles that rearranged themselves with growing urgency. Even so, their decline did not resemble suffering. It resembled dusk, a gradual dimming of the deep clarity with which they had once known the world. Some of them continued to listen, long after understanding began to fade, finding solace in the fragments of familiar rhythms. Others drifted into quieter states, as though preparing to return to the deeper silence beneath thought. And the youngest among them, born into the new rains, carried intelligences slightly altered, slightly sharp at the edges, as though their minds were trying to take a new shape. But even those new shapes were not enough. The world was entering an age that would require a different kind of mind, one not born from harmony, but from adaptation, one not shaped by cycles, but by struggle, one not attuned, but reactive. This earlier species, rooted in the breath of rains that no longer fell, could sense the widening distance between their essence and the changing planet. Still, they did not grieve. Grief belongs to those who resist endings. They accepted their fading as naturally as they once accepted emergence. For in the slow falling of unfamiliar rain, they heard the truth, that all intelligences eventually learn. The world moves on, and minds, no matter how gentle, no matter how ancient, must either follow or fall into silence. As the rains continued to change, the world they once understood began slipping through unseen cracks in time. Not suddenly, not harshly, just enough that each season felt slightly unfamiliar, a half-remembered melody played in a different key. The earlier species sensed this drift in the same way they sensed everything, through subtle resonance, through the soft weight of humidity, through the temperature of mist, woven around dawn. Where the ancient rains once carried warmth that soothed the land, The new rains brought minerals that felt colder, sharper, as though the earth itself had begun thinking in a different language. The forests that had risen with them, forests softened by warmth, rich with slow-breathing roots, began to shift. Leaves narrowed, fruits hardened, trees once content with steady climates learned to brace against unpredictable winds. Their harmonious companion, the world, was slowly becoming a stranger. Even the stones, which had always held the memory of heat, began to cool at their edges. Cracks formed in patterns that felt like pauses in a familiar song. The ground they once trusted now whispered of change, in tremors too subtle for later species, but unmistakable to them. In their gatherings, the air grew thick with contemplation. They were not beings who debated, they listened, and the world they listened to was shifting out of tune. A species born from gentle stability was meeting a planet that had begun to dream in restless cycles. Yet their response was not resistance. Resistance was foreign to them. They had no instinct to fight the world that had shaped their minds. Instead, they moved through this transition with a quiet grace, letting each new rainfall teach them what it could. Some found solace in the remnants of the old rains, tiny pockets of ancient climate, hidden in low valleys or sheltered beneath cliffs, untouched by the new winds. There, the rains still fell warm, still carried the familiar minerals that linked them to their earliest memories. But these sanctuaries were small, shrinking, fragments of a world that no longer existed, beyond their boundaries. Others roamed outward, hoping to find places where the new rains carried rhythms their minds could learn to follow. But each journey revealed only further change. Higher lands swept by thin, cold air, coastal regions reshaped by unpredictable tides, plains of young stone that still burned with the heat of recent uplift. No part of the shifting planet offered the sustained harmony their awareness required. The youngest among them adapted the fastest. Their minds, shaped by rain, with a sharper mineral taste, carried thoughts that formed more quickly, more intensely, but also more erratically. These young minds were restless, in ways the elders found unfamiliar, as if born holding questions the rains no longer answered. Even so, there was no conflict between generations. The species did not fracture, they simply drifted, like two branches of the same river, one remembering the old flow, the other learning the new, but the drift widened. The elders felt the widening as a dimming of the world's resonance. Their perception, once vast and effortless, grew muted. The deep currents of the earth, the slow speech of the mantle, the long exhale of seas, all once clear to them, blurred into indistinct murmurs. The young felt it differently. To them, the world was simply confusing, not unbearable, just unsteady, a place asking questions they did not know how to interpret. Yet this confusion carried the seeds of something important, the ability to adjust. But adjustment was too new, too slow, too late. As climates continued shifting toward a colder, more volatile age, the species' harmony unraveled, not dramatically, not with collapse, but like mist thinning. As the sun rises, they became less present, less attuned, their thoughts drifting into silence. Before they reached completion, the pockets of warm rain where they once gathered became rarer, then scarce, then gone. The earth had turned its page, and while the species still moved, still sensed, still existed, their resonance with the planet, the fundamental bond that defined them, had faded beyond repair. They were becoming guests, in a world that had once been home, and still they did not resist. They did not fear, they simply listened, as they always had. But the rain that fell upon them no longer carried their story. It carried the story of what would come after, and they began to understand, in their quiet, ancient way, that their time was closing, not as punishment, not as disaster, but as transition. The rains that had given them life were now guiding them gently toward their ending. For all things born from weather must eventually dissolve back into weather. In the last ages of their presence, the rains fell differently still, not colder, not warmer, just distant, as though the sky had forgotten how to speak to them. They felt this distance, in the small pauses between droplets, in the thinning mist at dawn, in the way storms arrived, without the familiar murmur that once signalled their approach. For a species shaped entirely by the nearness of weather, distance was not emptiness. It was silence. Not a harsh silence, but a settling one, the way dust settles in a long-abandoned valley, softly blanketing the memory of everything that once moved there. They did not gather to mourn, they gathered to listen. Even as their awareness dimmed, they listened for any echo of the old world. The warm rains, the steady tides, the ancient breath of forests, that once lifted their thoughts, like leaves carried by the gentlest wind. But what they heard instead was the age turning, a shift deeper than climate, older than change, a slow turning of the earth toward a future that no longer required their kind of mind. It was not cruelty, it was continuity. The world did not push them away. It simply moved past them, the way a river moves past a stone, without intention, without regret, carrying time forward. In currents they could no longer follow. Their presence grew thinner, less like a species, and more like a feeling, lingering at the edge of things, in the hush before rainfall, in the warmth that rises from stone. After a brief moment of sun, in the strange familiarity, some landscapes still carry, for reasons no one can name. One by one, their last gatherings dissolved into the drifting weather, not vanished, dissolved. Their thoughts unwound, like mist rising from the ground. After a calm night, their memories loosened into the atmosphere, joining the long cycle of evaporation and return, and perhaps, for a brief moment, before their awareness dimmed completely, they understood something no later species could ever feel, that to fade is not to be lost, only to be carried in another form. The rains that once gave them life lifted the last traces of their intelligence into the sky. There, it scattered softly, becoming part of the world's breath, a whisper suspended in the endless turning of water into cloud, and cloud into rain, and rain into memory. When they were finally gone, the earth did not feel empty. It felt changed, as though the planet had inhaled something. It was not yet ready to speak, and the next age began, not with them, but because of them. Their silence, folded into the deep weather of the world, became the quiet foundation for what would rise long after, in a time when the planet settled again and a different kind of mind opened its eyes to the long, patient world. But what the earth buried, it never truly forgot. It only stored in deeper currents, waiting to resurface. There are ages in Earth's history that left behind monuments of stone, mountains rising like old memories, fossils pressed into sediments that speak of creatures with bones, with shapes, with endings we can hold in our hands. But the age that held the earlier species, if it ever existed, is not one of those ages. It is an era swallowed by movement, by warmth, by oceans that had not yet learned patience, by continents still drifting through their childhood, soft around the edges, eager to become something else. It was an age that could not keep anything, not footprints, not artifacts, not even the briefest shadow of a mind capable of wonder. The earth was too young to remember. This is the problem with our search for what came before. The past is not a vault, it is a current, and this current does not store, it transforms. Anything that lived during that time was caught in a world that refused permanence. Rainfall washed landscapes away before they could dry. Seas rose and fell, with a pulse too quick for sediment to settle. Forests appeared and vanished, long before their roots could leave a signature in the soil. The crust itself was restless, cracking, folding, sinking, rising, breathing in long, deep motions that erased everything pressed against it. Even if the species had carved symbols into stone, the stone would not have survived. It would have melted back into fire or been dragged downward into the mantle, where pressure does not preserve, it forgets. And so the age became a kind of silent interlude in the geological record, a long breath between eras that left marks. We look for fossils, the Earth answers with nothing. Not because nothing lived, but because everything moved. Imagine this world, a landscape of newborn rock, still cooling from volcanic twilight, its surface delicate, easily rewritten by the next surge of magma, or the next tectonic sigh. Rivers had no loyalty. They carved a path for a season, and abandoned it the next. Seas intruded onto shores, only to retreat. When the land lifted from below, as if stretching in its sleep, every trace dissolved, even the memory of dissolution dissolved. This is why the earlier species, if it lived, would be invisible to us today. Not because it failed to exist, but because it existed in an era when the world refused to hold on to anything for more than a moment. And yet, when one stands in the presence of very old stone, stone that has crossed through fire, through pressure, through burial and unburial, there is a feeling, a faint unease, as if that stone contains more history than it can express. Not a story, but a silence thick with the ghosts of minerals that were once part of landscapes, melted down before memory formed, minerals that drifted through cycles, older than continents, older than life as humans define it. This silence is not emptiness, it is compression, the weight of time folded so deeply that meaning cannot escape. Perhaps the earlier species, shaped by rain, woven from mist, attuned to the long breath of the forming world, left traces that only time can feel, impressions too soft for stone, too subtle for carbon dating, but present nonetheless, in the quiet chemistry of the planet. But in the human sense, in the sense of fossils and remnants and ruins, their age left nothing but possibility. Perhaps this is what makes their story ache, that an entire world could bloom, think, fade, and leave behind no proof that it ever stood beneath its sky. But absence can speak too. Sometimes it speaks louder than presence. Sometimes what isn't found reveals more about the world that swallowed it than what is. And the Earth has swallowed many worlds. This age, the age that didn't leave fossils, was one of them. It was an age built of transitions, of oceans still learning their depth, of continents rising and collapsing before their own shadows could memorize their edges. It was an age too fluid to hold the imprint of a mind, and yet intelligence may have moved through it, softly, briefly, without insisting on permanence. Perhaps that was its strength. Perhaps that is why it vanished without scars. For minds shaped by impermanence do not fight disappearance. They drift into it, like a tide receding under a softer moon. In the geological record, their time is a blank, a silence. But silence is not nothing. It is simply another way. The Earth chose to speak. The silence of that era is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of transformation, the quiet that follows a wave after it collapses, the space left behind when a breath ends, and the next has not yet begun. The Earth, in those early ages, was a maker of fleeting worlds. It built landscapes the way tides build shapes in sand, beautiful, temporary, unconcerned with longevity. Nothing stayed where it was. Nothing kept the form it held. The crust folded and unfolded around itself, erasing whole regions before they had the chance to become anything that could be remembered. This was not destruction. This was youth. A young planet does not preserve. A young planet experiments. And so, even if the earlier species had walked its surface, even if they had gathered under the first rains, even if they had sensed the Earth's breath, with a depth no later species could match, the world around them would not have kept their footprints. Imagine one of their gathering places, a warm hollow near a volcanic spring, edges softened by steam, the air heavy with mineral rain. They may have rested there, for centuries, for generations, feeling the slow pulse of the world through the stone beneath them. But the stone would not rest. Pressure from below would push upward, tilting the land. The spring would move. The hollow would collapse. New lava would rise, erasing everything. What had once been sanctuary would become ash, then glass, then stone again, then nothing. Geologists call this process recycling. The planet calls it continuing. In such a world, intelligence had no hope of leaving a lasting mark. Even the seas were untrustworthy. They grew and shrank, like a restless tide inside the planet's own body, covering continents, before forests could root deeply enough to anchor themselves, then retreating again before those forests could leave their outlines in stone. The earlier species, attuned to the temporary nature of their world, would never have expected permanence. Not from forests, not from mountains, and certainly not from themselves. Perhaps that is why they lived so lightly, why their presence, if it ever existed, was woven entirely into cycles that vanished along with them. Their homes might have been built of evaporating mist, their languages shaped by rain that no longer falls, their memories carried in patterns of migration and moisture that the earth erased before anyone could inherit them. Everything about their world was transitional, not incomplete, just in motion. And motion is the enemy of evidence. For fossils require stillness, a body settling into sediment that remains undisturbed, long enough for minerals to replace what decays. But in that era, sediments did not remain still. They slid, they crumbled, they melted, they pressed deep into the crust where heat unmade them, before memory could crystallize. Even the ocean's floors did not keep their secrets. The crust beneath them was young and thin, eager to slide into subduction zones where the mantle consumed everything. Fossils, sand, minerals, history, grinding all evidence into molten forgetfulness. This is why the earlier species, if they ever bloomed, became invisible, not because they were small or fragile or few, but because the planet itself refused to keep records. Earth remembers selectively. It archives the durable and discards the delicate. But intelligence, especially intelligence born of rain and resonance, is delicate. It leaves behind no bones, no tools, no ruins, no scars. It leaves behind only the feeling that the world has been lived in longer than its visible story suggests. Stand in the presence of ancient metamorphic rock scraped and folded in the deep quiet beneath continents, and there is a sense of something compressed within, something unsaid, something that does not belong to the rocks alone. Not evidence, never evidence, but a whisper, a suggestion that the planet has known more than it can speak through fossils, and perhaps more than it chooses to speak at all. This age, this fluid, restless, unkeeping age, was the perfect cradle for a species that lived without permanence, and also the perfect shroud. Whatever intelligence rose in that time was destined to fade, without trace, without imprint, without returning, because in that world nothing stayed long enough to become a memory, and yet the absence of evidence has become its own presence, a quiet space into which imagination can flow. The age left no fossils, but it left a question, and questions, unlike bones, can last forever. There are intervals in Earth's history where time feels thin, not empty, but translucent, like a veil stretched across an era that refuses to reveal its face. The age of the earlier species, if it ever truly breathed, is one of those intervals. A stretch of time preserved not in artifacts, but in absences, in the quiet spaces between known epochs, in the layers of stone that say nothing when everything in them should have spoken. Geologists call these intervals hiatuses, pauses, unrecorded chapters. They appear as missing strata, as sudden jumps in the story written in stone, millions of years erased, in a line no thicker than a fingertip pressed against shale. Most assume erosion, simple and unremarkable, but sometimes the erosion feels deliberate, consistent, total, as though the planet itself swept clean an entire age. Perhaps it did. Perhaps the Earth, in its youth, had no interest in holding on to memories. Perhaps the earliest species, shaped from rain and resonance, lived in an era the world had already decided to forget. Imagine a landscape where mountains rose and vanished before the first roots could anchor themselves Imagine low continents, fracturing and drowning. Just as life began shaping familiar forms, imagine seas boiling with minerals that changed with every shifting vent, rewriting the chemistry of ecosystems before those ecosystems could leave a trace. In such a place, even the idea of a fossil feels optimistic. Bones require time, sediment requires stillness, memory requires patience. This era had none of these. Rivers carried more ash than sand. Storms rearranged coastlines as casually as a child rearranges patterns in dust. Volcanoes rose and broke open before they cooled into permanence. If the earlier species existed, they might have whispered their thoughts onto landscapes that lasted only hours in the scale of geologic reckoning. A valley they treasured could vanish in a single night of tectonic persuasion. A forest that shaped their earliest language could be lifted into ash by a breathing fault line. A place they returned to for generations might slip beneath a rising sea before those generations had fully learned its memory. Perhaps they understood this impermanence so completely that they never expected the world to hold on to them. Perhaps they viewed memory the way the earth did, as something to be carried within cycles, not carved into permanence. And so they left only what cycles can carry: patterns, not artifacts, traces in isotopes, where volcanic gases shifted in ways that should not have shifted, mineral seams that formed under conditions that should not have existed, odd quiet spaces in ancient sediments where life appears to hesitate, not stop, not collapse, just hesitate. A hesitation can hold a story if one knows how to listen. Some scientists look at these anomalies and see coincidence. Some see errors in sampling. Some see mysteries, not yet worth naming. But there are those who look into the blank spaces and feel a presence, not missing, but erased, as though the earth has chosen silence over remembrance. It is easy to forget how many times this planet has remade itself completely, how many worlds have existed beneath the world we know, how many ages have risen and dissolved, without leaving so much as a ripple in the fossil record. The earlier species, should they have existed, would have been one of those worlds, a world that learned to listen in an age when nothing stayed still long enough to be heard again. And so their traces would be carried not in stone, but in the faintest imbalances, slight deviations in mineral ratios, subtle murmurs in metamorphic layers, tiny shifts in the alignment of crystals that formed under pressures no longer present in the world. These are not proofs, they are impressions, the fingerprints of processes too delicate for the fossil record and too ancient for certainty. Yet there is a kind of honesty in the blank spaces, an honesty that says the past is not missing, only folded, compressed into forms that do not unfold easily, forms that resist the sharp edges of human understanding. The age that did not leave fossils did not fail. It simply moved too quickly, too fluidly, too quietly to be captured. Its story persists only in the spaces between layers, in the gaps where time held its breath. And perhaps in those breaths, the earlier species lived, briefly, beautifully, and beyond remembrance. There are layers in the planet's crust that feel less like stone and more like a pause, a hesitation in the Earth's long memory, a subtle interruption where something once existed and then slipped quietly out of time. These layers are thin, fragile, easy to miss. Yet when geologists cut through them, when they lift the powdery sediments that crumble at the slightest breath, there is a sense that these fragments once carried more than dirt and minerals. They carried moments, moments erased so completely that only their absence remains. It is here, in these ghostly strata, in these quiet interruptions, that the earlier species might have lived, not as a dominant force, not as architects of permanence, but as a soft presence that moved through the world like low fog, leaving impressions that vanished before they could solidify into evidence. To imagine them in this age is to imagine intelligence, existing in the margins of time thriving in a world too restless to archive. Their lives would have unfolded in landscapes that collapsed before they could fossilize, in coastlines that shifted, before their shapes were learned, in ecosystems that reorganized, before they could be preserved. Consider a shoreline where warm rains once gathered, where they might have listened to the hum of water against stone. In less than a geological breath, that shoreline could drown beneath rising seas and then rise again as folded mountains, thousands of miles from where the waves once touched it. No memory could survive this movement. The earth itself would forget. Yet forgetting, in this age, was not an act of cruelty. It was simply motion, the natural flow of a planet still shaping its identity. The earlier species, should they have existed, would have understood this. They would have recognized that the world they walked upon was a shifting dream, not a stage built to endure, and because their minds were shaped by water, they would have accepted impermanence as part of their being. They may have lived in forests that grew in crystalline patterns near volcanic shores, forests whose trunks rose quickly, fed by heavy mineral rains, only to collapse under new climates, before their roots could carve their forms into the soil. Those forests would leave no trace. Their inhabitants would leave even less. This is the nature of an age that did not leave fossils. Everything was in transition, even time, even memory. The species might have formed meaning from transitions themselves, from the way a coastline retreated, as if exhaling, from the way steam rose from a cooling lava plain that once held their quiet gatherings. To them, the world was not a collection of separate moments. It was a single, unfolding gesture, a gesture too large to be carved into stone. There are metamorphic rocks formed under pressures so intense that their minerals realign into patterns resembling woven fabric. Some geologists marvel at the strange precision of these crystal alignments, but perhaps these alignments are simply the last compressed whispers of worlds that came before, not messages, not symbols, but the geological equivalent of breath caught in the throat. When the earlier species faded, the age they lived in faded with them, not as a catastrophe, but as a turning of the Earth's many pages. The climate cooled, oceans settled, landscapes stabilized, bones could finally fossilize, sediments could finally stay still. Life could grow into forms that would one day be remembered. But the species shaped by rain had already dissolved into the unrecorded past. Their era ended, just as the world became capable of keeping stories, and so their story stayed unkept. What remains today is a gap, a thin, quiet seam between eras that remember and eras that cannot, a seam that feels like a missing thought, a forgotten sentence. In the planet's long narration, the Earth is filled with such silences, but this one is different. It feels inhabited, not by fossils, not by ruins, but by the faintest echo of a vanished awareness, a presence pressed so gently into the world that only time itself remembers where it rested, and time does not speak easily. In the end, that ancient era, the age that swallowed every trace of itself, folded into the planet, like a dream returning to darkness. No ruins remained, no bones, no imprints pressed into sediment, only the quiet suggestion that something once moved through the world so lightly that even time could not catch it. As the crust cooled and continents steadied, the Earth gained the ability to hold memories. Sediments began to settle without being lifted again. Oceans found rhythms they would keep for millions of years. Forests rooted themselves deeply enough to leave impressions in the buried soils beneath. But by then, the earlier species was gone. Their world had already vanished, not in fire, but in motion, not in collapse, but in transition. They lived in a moment where everything was temporary, and so they, too, became temporary. What the Earth could not hold, it allowed to drift. What it could not archive, it absorbed. What it could not remember, it folded into pressure and heat and the slow transformation of stone. Yet something remains, in the blank spaces of ancient layers, a subtle tension, a softness, a breath that does not belong to the rocks alone. Geologists feel it. Without knowing, they feel it. Climatic models bend around it, without understanding why. There is an echo. In the missing chapters, a faint impression of a mind that once listened to the rain and read the world in the language of water. It is not evidence. It is not history. It is the residue of possibility, and possibility lingers. Sometimes, when storms gather over landscapes, older than continents, there is a certain stillness that settles into the air, a moment where the world feels as though it is waiting for something it once knew, something it has not felt in ages. Perhaps that stillness is the last trace of the earlier species, not their form, not their memory, only the faint echo of a presence so diffuse, so gentle, that it sank into the earth without disturbing a single stone. The age that didn't leave fossils did not vanish. It simply folded itself into the deeper layers of time, where silence speaks in ways no strata can record. And from that silence, a question rises, soft, persistent, older than the first bone ever fossilized. What else has the world forgotten? The planet would turn again. The climates would shift. The seas would change their shape. And into this newly settled earth, another species would one day rise, not aware of the minds, washed away before them, but shaped by a world that had once known intelligence and once let it go. The next chapter of the planet would begin with steadier stone, cooler air, and long ages poised to hold memories at last. But even then, beneath the layers of rock and the deepening forests, the whisper of the earlier species remained, faint, unbroken, waiting. There are endings so quiet that the world does not notice them passing, endings that do not arrive with storms or fire or the shattering of landscapes, but with a soft change in the air, a subtle thinning of warmth, a dawn arriving slightly colder than the dawn before. The last days of the earlier species, if such a species ever lived, likely unfolded in this gentleness. Not a tragedy, not a collapse, just a slow dissolving of harmony. Their existence had always been a dialogue with the world that shaped them. They rose in rains that carried the planet's first tenderness, thrived in climates that breathed in long, steady rhythms, and listened to a sky that once knew how to speak softly. But now the sky was changing, not violently, not with warning, just enough that each morning felt slightly farther from the world they once understood. The rains that had formed their earliest memories fell with a new mineral taste, heavier, sharper, as though the earth had begun dreaming with a different part of itself. Forests that once held their presence, the way lungs hold breath, began to shift their leaves, their branches stiffening. In the subtle cold, roots dug deeper, seeking stability in soils that no longer carried the warmth of earlier ages. Even the ground beneath them felt altered, a faint tremor, a new tension, a restlessness rising from deep stone. The earth was rearranging itself in ways they could sense, but not interpret. To them, interpretation was alignment, understanding was resonance, meaning was harmony. But harmony was fading. In the final centuries of their existence, their gatherings became quieter, not out of fear. They did not know fear, but out of recognition, an awareness that the world was slipping into a new era, one whose patterns moved faster than their ancient senses could follow. They felt this most clearly in the mornings. Dawn used to bring warmth, a soft glow rising across the land, carrying with it the memory of the planet's earliest breaths. It was a time of renewal, a reaffirmation of the cycles they had always trusted. But toward the end, dawn arrived with a different intention. The sun rose the same, but the warmth beneath it felt borrowed, as if the light had travelled a longer path or passed through a sky that no longer held the same affection. Their mornings became moments of quiet hesitation. The earlier species, attuned to the faintest shifts in weather, began to feel a growing emptiness within the air. Not absence, but distance. A distance between them and the world, a distance between the way things were and the way things were becoming. It was in these quiet dawns that they first felt their fading. Not physically, their forms endured the climate well enough, but something deeper, something essential, something woven into the fabric of their intelligence began to loosen. What once connected them to the breath of forests, to the pulse of rain, to the warmth of stone, was slowly drifting out of reach. They moved through their last mornings with gentle curiosity rather than sorrow. Curiosity was all they had ever known, and the world, even in its unfamiliarity, was still beautiful to them. The mist that rose from cooling plains carried new scents. Unfamiliar minerals sparkled in early sunlight. Even the winds, though sharper, sang in new harmonies against the shifting shapes of land. They watched these changes with the patience of a species that had always accepted impermanence. Yet beneath that patience lay the first quiet truth of their ending. The warmth that once welcomed them no longer belonged to them. It was not a punishment. It was not a rejection. It was simply the earth turning its page. They would gather on high ridges to watch the dawn settle across the land, feeling the subtle dissonance between the warmth of light and the cold of the air. That faint contradiction was the first sign that their era had passed. The world was still beautiful, but it was no longer their world. And as the sun rose over their last mornings, carrying light that could no longer hold them, a quiet understanding settled into their fading awareness. They were becoming part of the past, not suddenly, not tragically, but gently, as all things born from rain eventually dissolve into the silence that shaped them. The mornings continued to change, and the species felt those changes in ways no other mind could have. For them, dawn was not just light, it was the first language of the world, the daily affirmation that the planet remembered its oldest rhythms. But toward the end, the light carried a different memory. It arrived thinner, as if stretched across distances the sky had never known before. The warmth it carried felt delayed, faint, a warmth that reached them, like a story repeated too many times to sound true. They gathered in silence, beneath this altered light, letting it fall across their forms, the way an old song falls across a listener who no longer recalls the tune. The earth had begun to tilt into new cycles. Cycles of cooling, cycles of shifting winds, cycles whispered from deep currents that carved fresh paths through molten stone. The species sensed these shifts in the quietest of ways. They felt them in the altered texture of mist, in the weight of moisture that clung differently to dawnlit air, in the tone of rainfall that no longer sang the way it did when the world was young. Their decline was not decay, it was dissonance. Their bodies still moved across plains and ridges, their senses still drifted through forests and valleys, but their connection, the deep alignment between their intelligence and the earth's breath, was loosening. Imagine a harp whose strings have fallen, slightly out of tune. The instrument still plays, still vibrates, still resonates, but the music it produces no longer matches the world around it. This was their lives. In the final centuries, they were still present, still aware, still attuned, but the music of the earth was changing its key, and they, born from a different melody, could not follow. Some among them wandered farther than ever before, moving into climates that felt colder, drier, less familiar. These were the younger ones, minds shaped by rains, already shifting toward a new era. They searched for resonance in unfamiliar places, perhaps sensing that the world was preparing for whichever species would come next. But even they could not escape the widening distance between what the world was becoming and what the species had been. Their elders, who had known the ancient warmth, remained in the valleys that still held the faintest echoes of earlier cycles. There, the mornings felt closer to the world they remembered, but even those remnants were fading. The warm rain that once welcomed their thoughts no longer gathered in familiar patterns. Storms arrived with a chill that seeped into the ground, into the roots of forests, into the foundation of the species' understanding. Their intelligence had always been an extension of climate, a living reflection of the world's earliest gentleness. So, when that gentleness thinned, their thoughts thinned with it. They found it harder to sense distant tremors. The deep hum of the mantle grew quiet to them. The language of clouds, once clear and rich, became vague, blurred, like words half remembered upon waking. Still, there was no panic, no desperation. Their minds were not shaped for fear. They responded to endings the way they responded to beginnings, with listening. They gathered on ridges to watch the changing skies. They rested beside the new rivers that cut through cooling rock. They followed the altered storms as far as their sense allowed, and they learned. Even in their fading, they learned. But what they learned was not how to survive. It was how to let go. They began to understand that their intelligence, born from a world of warmth and harmony, belonged to an age that had already ended. The Earth was entering a colder era, a harder era, an era that required a different kind of resilience. And the species felt, with quiet clarity, that they were becoming guests in a world that no longer spoke their language. Their final mornings carried this truth, a truth wrapped in pale sunlight that touched them gently, as if offering farewell. The warmth, they remembered, was nearly gone, but its echo remained, a ghost of a comfort that once shaped everything they were. And in that echo, they felt their ending approaching, not as loss, but as release. For what is born from dawn must eventually follow it into dusk. As the planet slipped deeper into its cooling age, the species did not vanish all at once. They thinned, like mist rising from stone, like warmth lifting from a cooling dawn. Their fading began not in great deserts or broken coastlines, but in the subtle places, the hollows where warm rains once lingered, a little longer than anywhere else. These hollows had cradled their emergence. Now, they carried the first quiet signs of their departure. The rains arrived later, then lighter, then, at last, not at all. To a mind shaped entirely by water, by humidity, by the breath of climate, this absence was more profound than the end of a season. It was the end of a language. Without those rains, their thoughts felt incomplete, distracted, as though pieces of themselves remained in clouds that no longer returned to them. The forests, too, began to change, in ways that felt unfamiliar. Leaves narrowed, preparing for cooler winds. Branches toughened. Plants once lush and broad became lean, cautious things, shaped not by abundance, but by endurance. To the species who sensed the world through the softness of cycles, these new forests felt distant, not hostile, simply different. And difference, in their final centuries, was the quiet marker of separation. As regions cooled, their gatherings grew smaller, where once hundreds moved in fluid unison through mist-thick valleys, now only a few, stood among the morning vapours, listening for a rhythm they could no longer hear. It wasn't loss that they felt most deeply, it was unfamiliarity. Their world was changing faster than their minds could follow. This species, built for harmony, found itself drifting, in a landscape learning the language of struggle. They had known hardship before, but hardship with instability. Storms that followed patterns, droughts that arrived with meaning. Even disruption had once been gentle. But now, disruption was becoming rule. Weather shifted suddenly. Rains arrived in strange bursts, or not at all. Tides carved new shapes in the land, without warning or rhythm. Where once the world had been an extension of themselves, it now felt like something separate, beautiful, vast, but no longer familiar. This separation was not immediate. It grew gradually, layer by layer, over thousands of years. First, they sensed less. Then, they understood less. Then, they remembered less. Their awareness, once stretching across valleys and storms, began to contract, not because they feared, but because their senses no longer found a surface to hold on to. Like a tide withdrawing, after a long intimacy with the shore, their intelligence pulled inward, retreating into quieter spaces. Some among them continued to move, across vast distances, following storms, in hopes of finding the warmth that once shaped them. But the storms they pursued no longer carried the same minerals, the same patterns, the same breath. They would pause beneath strange new clouds, listening for the echo of their ancient rains. But the echo was gone. Others settled in the remaining pockets of warmth, small, isolated valleys, where the climate lingered just slightly longer in its older form. But even these refuges dimmed with time. It was here that the species felt their deepest recognition that the world had not betrayed them nor abandoned them. It had simply changed, and they, shaped by a gentler age, could not change with it. Yet there was no despair. Despair belongs to minds that cling. This species did not cling. To them, existence had never been possession. It had been participation, a sharing of breath between intelligence and world. If the world's breath shifted into a new rhythm, it was not their place to resist. So their final centuries were marked by acceptance, an acceptance woven into the way they rested, beneath cold dawns, into the way they touched, the last warm stones of their era, into the way their awareness wrapped gently around the changing forest shapes. They were not fighting to remain, they were learning how to depart, and as they slowly withdrew from the landscapes that had taught them everything, the world did not darken. It simply softened, as though easing them into the long quiet that awaited. The warmth of their final dawns was dimmer but still present, a pale echo of the first warmth that had welcomed them into existence. They felt that echo as a final kindness, a reminder that the world they loved was still holding them even as they slipped from its memory. The final centuries of their presence were not marked by collapse, but by thinning, a gradual transparency that made their existence feel lighter than ever before. They were still there, moving through forests, whose leaves grew narrower each season, resting beside rivers that carried colder breath downstream, listening to storms, whose voices had changed into cadences they could not translate. But they moved, as if half remembered by the world. Their earliest ancestors had risen within warmth, within stable rains that fell like reassurance. Their intelligence was a thread woven from the softness of early climates, from a time when the earth spoke slowly, patiently, and in tones that welcomed thought. Now the world spoke in a different voice, sharper, quicker, more restless. The rhythm of landscapes had shifted. Mountains cooled faster, storms travelled farther, tides learned new shapes. These shifts did not break the species. They loosened them, their sense of the earth's breath, once so clear. It felt like part of their own awareness, grew faint, like hearing a familiar song, played from too far away. Their thoughts, once expansive, began to shorten, not because they lacked intelligence, but because the world no longer offered the continuous cycles their minds depended on. The earlier species had always existed within the flow of environment, their minds a reflection of the planet's earliest gentleness. As that gentleness faded, so too did the clarity that lived within them. Even their gatherings changed. Where once they moved, in fluid unison, sharing awareness, across mist-filled meadows, they now gathered in smaller groups, closer together, as though drawing warmth from the presence of one another. It wasn't fear, it wasn't confusion, it was simply instinct. An instinct born not of survival, but of belonging. They belonged to a world that was slipping away. And so, slowly, they withdrew from the regions where the climate changed fastest. They sought the last pockets of warmth, valleys still touched by remnants of ancient rains, cliffs positioned perfectly to collect the sun's lingering heat, streams fed by deep springs that carried the memory of a warmer earth. These refuges became their final sanctuaries. But even sanctuaries cannot exist outside time. Each generation found the world slightly different, air a little sharper, storms a little harsher, winds a little less forgiving. The younger ones, born into this new climate, carried minds, shaped by change rather than stability. Their awareness was narrower, faster, less expansive than the elders. They could adapt more readily, but adaptation was not the foundation of their intelligence. Their species had bloomed from alignment, not competition, from resonance, not reaction. And so even the young, agile in thought, sharp in perception, felt the slow drifting between themselves and the world that raised them. There was no sudden moment where they realized their era was ending. It happened the way shadows lengthen, gradually, unavoidably, beautifully. Still, they continued to live with the same quiet grace that had shaped their beginning. They watched the cooling of dawn as though watching the turning of a familiar page. They listened to winds carrying scents from newly forming forests. They would not grow old enough to understand. They touched the last warm stones of their age, as though memorizing the world through the feel of its fading heat. In their final ages, dawn became a moment of deep reflection. The light that rose was no longer the light that had been promised to them in the youth of the planet, but it was still light, still beautiful, still a gesture of the world toward whatever intelligence would one day rise in their place. And perhaps, on their last mornings, they understood this, that existence is not ownership, but participation, that intelligence, no matter how old or gentle, is a visitor, a passing warmth in the long story of stone. As they gathered beneath their final dawns, their forms softened in the pale light. They carried no anger, no resistance, only a quiet recognition that they were returning to the silence from which they once emerged, a silence that would hold their last traces in ways no fossil ever could, a silence that would not remember specifics but would remember warmth, and through that warmth something of them would remain. In the end, their world did not darken. It grew pale, a soft dimming of warmth, a thinning of the air's old gentleness, a quieting of rains that once carried their earliest memories. The species felt this final shift, not as a breaking, but as a cooling of dawn, of thought, of the bond between their intelligence and the world that shaped it. They gathered, as they always had, in the places where warmth lingered longest, valleys cradled in the last soft breaths of ancient climate, ridges that held the earliest light. Before the sky changed its mind, springs that carried faint reminders of the earth's young tenderness. But each gathering felt slightly more translucent than the one before, their presence like a memory the world struggled to hold. The youngest among them, restless with a sense they could not understand, drifted farther than the elders ever did, searching for a resonance that no longer existed anywhere. And the elders, gentle in their understanding, watched these wanderings with a compassion that needed no words. They knew what the world was telling them. In their final dawns, the light touched them delicately, as if aware that it no longer carried the warmth they once recognized. The sun rose, but its warmth was thin, a fragile echo of the first warmth that had shaped their minds. They accepted this echo as a final kindness, a final whisper from the age that had birthed them. Their intelligence did not collapse. It receded, softly, patiently, like mist, realizing it is no longer held by the embrace of morning air. One by one, their gatherings scattered into quiet places, not to escape, but to return. Return to stone, to soil, to water, to silence. Their final moments were not moments at all, but a slow unwinding, a gentle loosening of the thread that bound them to the world. There was no last individual, no final breath, no witness, just a gradual thinning of presence until the world no longer felt the faint pressure of their awareness. Yet something remained, not in fossils, not in ruins, but in warmth. A warmth carried forward in the chemistry of early soils, in the softness of certain valleys, in the delicate pause before storms gather strength. A warmth that the earth buried, but did not forget. As the last of their intelligence dissolved into silence, the world shifted, preparing for new eras, new climates, new minds that would one day rise, without knowing that the warmth beneath their dawns was borrowed from a species the earth once held with quiet affection. Their extinction was not erasure, it was an exhale, a final sigh from an age that slipped beneath the crust before memory hardened. And what the planet buried, it never fully forgot, only folded deeper, waiting for the right era to let a different story begin. Long after the earlier species dissolved into silence, the world continued its slow reshaping, a reshaping so vast, so patient, that no living mind could feel it happening. Only the planet itself could sense its own drifting. Continents moved, the way memories shift in sleep, quietly, without clear beginning or end, as though the earth were turning over, to rest on a different side of itself. The age that followed their extinction was not an age of life rising, but of land learning, its own weight. Mountains that once stood as warm guardians over their final gatherings were pushed downward, into the deep dark of the mantle, where pressure rewrote them into minerals that remembered nothing. Oceans spread their boundaries, as if stretching after a long confinement, flooding plains, where the species once listened to the morning rains. Valleys they walked through became seafloors. Seafloors they never touched became towering ranges. Everything turned over, folded, rearranged, as though the planet was sorting through memories and deciding which ones to keep and which ones to bury. What it chose to bury was not their presence, but the world that had held it. The earth does not erase with intent. It erases with movement. Movement is the planet's oldest language. It speaks through drifting plates, through pressure rising beneath crust, through the slow grinding of continents searching for balance. As the continents turned over, the landscapes that shaped the earlier species disintegrated into processes that did not know how to preserve. Their final valleys descended into subduction zones where stone falls like forgotten stories, into heat that unravels everything. Their forests, pressed beneath younger soils, heated into coal-like shadows that carried no trace of the intelligence once held in their shade. And their rivers, those delicate veins that once carried the planet's warmth through the lands they inhabited, were redirected, cut apart, folded into deeper and more ancient waters. A river that had once been a central thread in their final migrations became nothing more than a mineral seam, trapped inside metamorphic rock. All of it turned over, all of it shifted into the deep mechanisms beneath the surface of things. If one could view the earth from far above time, their entire era would appear as a thin, fragile skin that peeled away. As the planet changed, its posture, continuity, in this new age, belonged to stone, not to memory, not to intelligence. Land drifted like pages, rearranging themselves in a book too vast for any single story to survive intact. Islands merged, mountains rose from the ruins of older mountains. Entire coastlines disappeared into the patient mouth of the sea. Somewhere in those transformations, the last trace of the earlier species was folded downward into depths no later mind would ever reach. Not lost, not destroyed, just placed. Somewhere, silence is most complete, beneath kilometers of stone and the endless turning of geological breath. And yet, despite this burial, something of them remained in the way the land settled afterward, as if the planet, having known intelligence once, shifted its weight differently, a subtle realignment left behind. By their quiet passage, the world was becoming ready for a new form of mind, but not yet. This was still the age of reshaping. The age of continents. Finding their long-term homes, volcanoes rose where their refuges once stood. Deserts formed over ancient seas. Crags split open to reveal minerals older than the species that had once walked above them. Everything changed except the silence. Silence endured in the cracks of stone, in the spaces between tectonic breaths, in the layered weight of a planet holding secrets too deep for light to reach. And in that silence, something waited, not a species, not a mind, just the lingering possibility of intelligence returning someday, in a world prepared at last to remember. For now, the Earth continued its slow, inevitable rearrangement. Continents turned, seas moved, stone rose and fell, with the rhythm of an organism reshaping its body. What the planet buried, it folded into itself. What it forgot, it stored in minerals that would one day hold the faint tension of lives dissolved before memory began. This was the world being prepared for what would come after. A world clearing its canvas. A world rewriting itself in deep geological breaths. And from this rearranged Earth, a new story would eventually rise. One shaped not by rains, but by survival, not by harmony, but by change. As the continents drifted across the surface of the planet, their slow collisions and quiet separations carved new shapes into the world. Shapes no living creature then could understand. Shapes that carried the weight of millions of years, without leaving a single moment, that remembered the earlier species. The Earth was busy rewriting itself. It folded ancient coastlines into the deep chambers of the mantle, compressing sediments into crystalline tapestries that forgot the softness of rain once whispered upon them. It shattered mountains that had once sheltered warm valleys, lifting their remnants into jagged new ranges that bore no memory of gentler worlds beneath. In those transformations, time moved like pressure, invisible, relentless, patient. The earlier species, already dissolved into silence, drifted deeper into the folds of this great rearrangement. Their traces became indistinguishable from the minerals around them, their last impressions, pressed and heated into structures that would one day be mined and studied with no understanding of the intelligence quietly trapped within. The continents did not mourn, they simply moved. Movement, in this age, became the Earth's way of preparing for what came next. A slow organization of land and sea into a pattern capable of holding more stable climates, more complex ecosystems, more enduring possibilities. Yet the planet's rearranging was far from gentle. Chains of volcanoes erupted across newly forming boundaries, casting ash into skies that had never known such sustained fire. Earthquakes rippled through young crust, opening new basins as quickly as they closed others. Rivers redirected their flow in a single night of tectonic persuasion. Each shift broke whatever fragile echo remained of the earlier species world. Even the soils, those transient layers where life takes root, were overturned. New minerals surfaced from deep fissures, cooling into forms that had never touched sunlight before. The old soils, soft with the memory of ancient rains, were buried beneath strata that would carry the signatures of newer eras. But burial is not disappearance, it is transformation. What sank did not vanish. It became part of the geological pulse, the recycled breath of stone learning, its next shape. Somewhere in these layers, the last warmth of the earlier species dawns was pressed into minerals that could not speak but held the faint tension of something once alive, something once harmonized with the world's earliest climates. During this immense reordering, oceans took advantage of every opportunity to expand into new spaces. They flooded lowlands that had once been sanctuaries for early intelligence. They climbed over crumbling shores, claiming them with tides colder than any those beings had ever known. And deep within the seas, new currents formed, currents that would one day guide migrations of unfamiliar species through waters rich with new life. But for now, those currents only carried the remnants of dissolved eras. The earth was not cruel, it was becoming. The quiet dissolution of the earlier species was just another breath in a planet, still learning how to hold itself steady. The continents did not know what they were erasing. They only knew their own restless drift. As landmasses rearranged, they created barriers and bridges that would one day matter to life more resilient than anything that had walked before. They forged oceans deep and cold enough to nurture species that could endure shifting climates, species that could adapt instead of align. And the quiet echo of the earlier species sank beneath each transformation, not fading, but becoming harder to trace. Their last alignment with the earth was carried downward, layer by layer, into regions where even the planet's memory grew molten, yet something of them remained between the crushing pressures, not a fossil, not a mark, but an impression so subtle it could only be felt in the way certain minerals crystallized under stress, in the faint warmth that lingers in metamorphic folds, in the strange stillness of ancient rocks that seem older than their own formation. The turning of continents was not their story's end. It was the beginning of everything that came after. The earth had cleared its canvas. The world had prepared its stage. And from this new arrangement of land, from this steadying planet, life would rise again, this time with a different kind of mind, a mind that would not sense the world through harmony, but through struggle, a mind that would not dissolve with climate shifts, but evolve within them, a mind born for a world that had already forgotten the gentler species that came before. As the continents continued their slow drift across the surface of the planet, the Earth entered an age of deep restructuring, an age defined not by the presence of life, but by the planet's need to shape itself into something enduring. The earlier species, once woven into the delicate warmth of ancient climates, was now so far beneath the surface of time that even the Earth itself could no longer feel their presence. But echoes do not vanish, they compress. And in the immense rearrangement of land and sea, those echoes travelled downward, folded into the pressure of forming mountains, carried into the molten underbelly of subducted continents, infused into minerals that would hold their faint warmth, long after memory had hardened into stone. Above ground, the world was becoming unfamiliar, even to itself. Land cracked under the weight of shifting plates, exposing glowing seams of magma that hissed as they touched open air. Volcanoes erupted with a frequency that turned skies into wandering tapestries of ash and light. Seas churned in restless motions, their currents accelerating as continents opened and closed gateways across their vast bodies. The earth was stretching, adjusting, becoming. In this era of upheaval, landscapes that once carried the last footprints of the earlier species were unmade and remade in cycles too vast for memory to grasp. Picture a valley that once held their final dawns, a place where warm stones had welcomed their fading presence, where mist had drifted like soft breath across early forests. Now imagine that valley being pressed downward over millions of years, its shape collapsing into deep folds of the crust until it lay miles below the surface, crushed into mineral layers that bore no resemblance to the gentle world it once cradled. This was the fate of every landscape they had ever known. Where warm rains once fell, new seas rose. Where forests once softened the air, mountains thrust upward like frozen waves of stone. Where rivers once carried their last reflections, new deserts spread, carved by winds sharper than any they had ever sensed. The continents were not merely drifting, they were turning, flipping the planet's pages, swapping the positions of worlds, rewriting the map that life had once walked upon. And beneath these colossal movements, their presence, or what little remained of it, was carried deeper and deeper. into regions, where time no longer flows in years, but in mineral transformations. Down there, in those unseen realms, everything is memory. Stone remembers each pressure, minerals remember each alignment, heat remembers each intrusion of foreign rock. It is in such memory that the faintest ghost of the earlier species may still exist, not as remains, not as evidence, but as an anomaly, a slight irregularity in a crystalline structure, a subtle warmth trapped in minerals that should have cooled, a tension deep within metamorphic folds that speaks of something the earth once held with gentle weight. These are not records, they are residues, impressions left by existence, too delicate to leave an imprint. Above these deep memories, the world grew more stable, the great collisions slowed, the continents settled into positions that would one day cradle the rise of forests, deserts, grasslands, and creatures bold enough to etch their presence into stone. But at the time of this settling, the world was still a canvas, waiting for its next story. Rain fell, in patterns different from the ancient storms that once shaped the earlier species, cooler, more fragmented, more suited to life that would need to endure, rather than harmonize. The seas calmed, just enough to nurture ecosystems that could anchor themselves to stable climates. Currents found rhythms that would eventually guide the migrations of future species, and the land, now vast, diverse, and anchored, prepared to hold its first true fossils. It is a strange irony that the Earth learned to remember only after it had forgotten, the species perhaps most attuned to its earliest breath. But forgetting is not the same as erasing. Sometimes forgetting is simply making space, clearing room for the next form of life to rise and leave its mark on the quiet canvas of stone. As the continents turned over and the planet cooled into deeper cycles, the Earth exhaled into a new stability. From that stability, a different kind of mind would eventually emerge. A mind unafraid of change, a mind built for survival, a mind shaped by struggle rather than harmony. But beneath it all, buried under continents that drifted like slow thoughts, the earlier species remained, not alive, not present, but held in the planet's most silent places, waiting without expectation, resting without memory, a warmth folded into stone. As the continents settled into the positions they would hold for millions of years, the world entered a quieter phase. Quiet, not in sound, but in intention. The planet's restlessness eased, its movements lengthened into deeper, slower breaths. What had once been a young world, trying to find its shape, was now a maturing Earth, learning how to hold itself steady. In this long, deliberate stillness, a strange consequence emerged. The buried memories of the earlier species, those faint impressions folded into stone, became even more obscured. Stability, paradoxically, hid them better than chaos ever did. For when the world was young and shifting, layers mixed, landscapes overturned, and ancient sediments resurfaced, just long enough to linger in the open air before being swallowed again. Now, with continents holding firm and climates settling into predictable cycles, those deep layers remained sealed, locked beneath miles of crust, entombed in the quiet darkness, where even the Earth's oldest stories sleep without voices. Above these hidden depths, new climates formed, cooler, more structured, less forgiving. The rains that shaped the earlier species had vanished entirely, replaced by storms that carved rather than nurtured, by winds that sculpted deserts into long, patient dunes. Forests emerged that would one day host creatures with bones strong enough to fossilize, oceans stabilized into patterns that would support vast networks of life. The stage was being set for a new lineage to rise, but the echoes of the species before remained buried beneath it all, their presence softened into geological memory. Still, even in this silence, the Earth carried traces. in ways too subtle for fossils or artifacts. There were places where heat rose from the ground, with a warmth that felt older than the crust around it. Places where minerals aligned in patterns that defied simple geological explanation. Crystals twisted, compressed, as though shaped by a pressure more delicate than the planet's brute force. A presence persisted. In these anomalies, not a message, but a suggestion, a faint reminder that the Earth had once held an intelligence far older than anything, yet written in stone. But the surface world moved on. Rivers carved new paths across stabilizing continents. Mountains cooled into quiet guardians of the sky. Valleys deepened into fertile basins that would one day cradle creatures with eyes, with breath, with the restless energy of evolution. Nothing in these new landscapes seemed to recall the gentle species that had once greeted dawn with the warmth of early sunlight. And yet, every now and then, a stillness settled across certain plains, certain cliffs, certain deep forest floors, a stillness that did not belong to the climate or the stone, but to something older, something waiting. It was the same stillness that lived in metamorphic folds, in the quiet geometry of ancient minerals, in the barely perceptible tension between layers of stone that had once been forests, valleys, and warm morning refuges. Such stillness is not emptiness. It is memory without form, memory the earth itself carries in ways no species can translate. As the world continued its slow transformation, sea levels rose and fell in cycles more deliberate than before. Tides moved with cooler intent. Snow collected on the shoulders of young mountains that had once been sea floor. The planet was preparing for eras, defined not by dissolution, but by endurance. Creatures emerged whose bodies could leave permanent marks, marks the earth was now stable enough to preserve. Shells hardened, bones strengthened, forest litter accumulated in layers thick enough to fossilize under the right conditions. Life had learned to become legible, but the earlier species had never sought legibility. They had lived in the soft margins of the world, in climates that refused permanence. So nothing of their presence rose with the new land, nothing resurfaced with the uplift of mountains, nothing revealed itself in the long erosion of ancient rock. They remained as they had lived, quietly, gently, invisible to the unfolding era. Still, in certain places, the earth felt inhabited by something beyond its visible memory, a warmth beneath cold soil, a softness in wind passing across stone, a hush in the air before rain falls. Not evidence, just the faint reminder of a species the earth once sheltered in its earliest tenderness. What was buried remained buried, but what was felt continued to whisper in the planet's deeper layers, a whisper that would accompany the world into new ages, new continents, new minds, long after the earlier species had dissolved into the great silence beneath the turning crust. When the great drift of continents finally slowed, the earth entered a long breath, a breath so deep that it felt like the world was resting after centuries of movement. The crust cooled, mountains settled into their shapes, valleys deepened into quiet permanence. Seas found the rhythms they would carry for eons. But beneath these new landscapes, beneath forests preparing to cradle new life, beneath oceans ready to nurture creatures that would one day fossilize, the traces of the earlier species remained buried so deeply that even time had trouble reaching them. Not fossils, not ruins, just warmth, just pressure, just the faint, silent echo of a mind that once aligned so delicately with the earth that its memory blended with the memory of stone itself. As the continents turned, as lands collided and drifted apart again, their presence slipped into deeper layers, folded under miles of crust that carried them farther from the light. They became part of the planet, not in form, not in story, but in feeling. like a forgotten emotion buried beneath thought, like the warmth in a rock long after the sun has moved, like a memory so ancient that even the earth no longer knows where it came from. And yet, that quiet remnant persisted, woven into metamorphic seams, held in crystals formed under pressures, too delicate to replicate, resting in places where the planet stores its oldest, softest traces. Above them, the world changed without pause. Life expanded, thrived, multiplied, sending tendrils of possibility across every continent. The Earth began writing the eras we know, eras filled with creatures that left their stories in stone. Still, the deep quiet where the earlier species rested did not dissolve. It remained untouched beneath the shifting weight of the world's new ambitions. Sometimes, when mountains rise, when deep earthquakes tremble, when ancient rock folds into new forms, a whisper escapes, a faint suggestion that something once lived in the soft warmth of an earlier dawn. It is not a message. It is not a memory. It is simply the planet remembering itself, touching, for an instant, the impression of a species that passed through its youth, like a gentle breath. And as the Earth turned toward the next era, toward new climates, new oceans, new minds, that whisper remained, hidden beneath continents that had settled at last, a quiet resonance waiting in the deep for a world ready to listen to whatever intelligence came next. Long after the earlier species faded into the warmth of their final dawns, long after the continents folded their traces into the silent depths of stone, the Earth entered a stretch of time so vast, so unbroken, that it felt like the planet itself had fallen into a deep and dreamless sleep. This was not a sleep of stillness. It was a sleep of forgetting, a sleep in which the world held what it had buried, not as memory, but as pressure, as heat, as quiet. In this immense interval, millions of years passed, as effortlessly as breaths. Oceans shifted their boundaries. Mountains rose and crumbled. Forests appeared where none had been, then vanished again, without leaving anything but faint impressions in sediment. Life expanded, contracted, adapted, and evolved. But none of these changes reached the deep layers, where the earlier species was folded into silence. Their absence became part of the planet's equilibrium. The world no longer felt their presence, yet something of them remained in the foundation of things. A warmth in certain minerals, a softness in the air, before certain storms, a resonance in the land, where dawn light touches stone with unexplainable tenderness. These were not fragments of them, they were reflections, echoes of what it meant to once exist, in harmony with climates that no longer breathed. During this long interval, the Earth did not produce another species like them, not because it could not, but because the world no longer held the conditions that could nurture intelligence, born from warmth and resonance. The planet's new climates favoured different forms. Life that grew through competition, adapted through hardship, survived by change rather than alignment. These new species did not inherit the earlier species' gentleness. They inherited the Earth as it had become, a place of shifting temperatures, of rising and falling seas, of landscapes that demanded resilience. But beneath these new lives, beneath the expanding forests and teeming oceans, the lost species slept in a silence that felt more like waiting than absence. The Earth carried them the way a river carries sediment. Not intentionally, but inevitably, time pressed them downward, burying their remnants under younger worlds that knew nothing of the minds that had once moved, like thoughts across the land. What remained of them was not fossil, not bone, not artifact, but a deep geological warmth that lingered in places no light could reach, a warmth older than ice ages, older than species with spines, older than the first forests that stretched into the sun. This warmth was not physical heat, but an imprint, a lingering echo of their presence, their way of thinking, their gentle attunement to the world's earliest breath. In some remote part of the crust, where ancient valleys had been crushed into metamorphic memory, pressures shifted in slow, rhythmic pulses, as though something deep within still held the cadence of their vanished intelligence. But the world above moved on in complete ignorance. Storms gathered without carrying their voices. Sunlight fell across continents that had never known their shape. Species rose that sensed the world not through harmony, but through hunger. The earlier species would not have recognized this Earth, this planet of sharpened climates and relentless change. Their era had been gentle, soft around the edges, its dangers measured in cycles they could read, like familiar stories. But now the world had entered the age of unpredictability, a place where survival required a different kind of mind. And so their long sleep continued, buried beneath epochs that layered themselves into mile-thick histories. The earlier species rested in a silence deeper than memory, a silence the earth guarded with the weight of continents. Yet that silence was never empty. It held the faintest tension, the quiet ache of something once present, now hidden beyond reach. The earth carries its lost children, whether it remembers them or not. It carries them in stone, in pressure, in warmth, in the long sleep, between one kind of mind and the next, a sleep from which nothing awakens, but through which everything that follows is shaped, even if only in ways too slight for time to speak aloud. The ages that followed were slow in their unfolding, so slow that even time seemed uncertain, whether it was meant to move forward or simply settle more deeply into the quiet cradle of the earth. What slept beneath the crust? The gentle species dissolved by changing climates, folded into stone by drifting continents, erased by the restless patience of geology, remained untouched by the transformations above. Their presence lay hidden in folds of metamorphic rock that carried the faintest warmth of the dawns they once welcomed. Not a heat the skin could feel, but a lingering memory of warmth, woven into the very structure of minerals, a warmth so subtle that even the earth itself seemed to cradle it unconsciously. Above them, new worlds rose and vanished, with the rhythm of drifting epochs. Forests expanded across vast continents, thick with life that breathed differently, moved differently, understood differently. Creatures emerged, whose senses were shaped by hunger, by instinct, by the urgency of survival. Minds built not from harmony, but from the sharp efficiency required by a changing planet. These minds left traces, fossils hardened in sediment, footprints pressed into mud, shells preserved in layers. The earth was finally stable enough to protect rather than consume. Yet none of these traces reached the depths where the earlier species slept. Their world was sealed away, a chapter compressed, beneath stories newer, louder, and more insistent. In certain quiet moments, when pressure deep beneath the crust shifted slightly, the earth released subtle murmurs, vibrations travelling upward, the faintest echoes of geological memory. But by the time these murmurs reached the surface, they were indistinguishable from the ordinary tremble of tectonic breath. Nothing above could interpret what those murmurs once meant, and yet the planet carried them. It carried everything it had ever held. The earlier species had left nothing visible, but something of their way of being remained folded into the deeper architecture of the earth. A softness in certain strata, a warmth in certain stones, a strange stillness, in places untouched by wind for thousands of years. This stillness was not relic, nor memory, nor haunting, but resonance, a quiet after-image of minds attuned to the breath of the world. While they slept beneath epochs, the earth changed above them into forms they could never have imagined. Seas opened where none had been, dry lands flooded with new warmth, or froze beneath great sheets of ice. Whole climates shifted like curtains drawn by unseen hands. In one age, tropical forests covered continents from pole to pole. In another, ice clawed its way down mountain flanks, rewriting valleys. With relentless cold, life surged in waves, sometimes lush, sometimes sparse, sometimes trapped in long cycles of struggle. But beneath all this, the earlier species remained in perfect stillness. They were not aware. Awareness was a surface phenomenon, a property of minds, exposed to light and weather. But the impression they left in the deepest layers of stone did not need awareness to persist. The earth carries impressions, the way memory carries dreams, in forms softened by pressure and time, in shapes no longer literal, but deeply, undeniably present. If the earlier species had ever wondered what would come after them, they left no answer. Their story was a soft exhale, not a question. Their ending was not a legacy. It was a return to the world that formed them. Still, as new eras rose above their resting place, the earth seemed to hold a quiet tension, as though remembering the gentleness of a species that never sought to leave a mark. It is possible, only as a poetic truth, not a scientific one, that the planet shaped future climates with the faint aftertaste of the harmony they once carried, that the Earth's slow settling into more stable rhythms was in some way influenced by the memory of having held intelligence before, not consciously, not deliberately, just as warmth lingers in a room long after the fire has gone out, a warmth so soft that only deep time can feel it. As the lost species slept inside their cradle of stone, the earth prepared for a new awakening. Not theirs. Their time had passed, like mist evaporating from dawn. But the world, rested from its long drift, was ready at last to cradle minds that could survive in climates of change, that could rise from struggle rather than harmony. The next eyes that would look upon the world were still millions of years away, but the Earth was quietly shaping itself to meet them. The planet's long sleep was not a single era, but a tapestry of countless ages layered together. Warm ages, cold ages, ages of rising seas, and ages when glaciers pressed their weight against the bones of continents. Through all of it, the earlier species, long dissolved into the soft pressures of stone, remained folded in silence so complete that even time itself seemed to move around them, not through them. Above their quiet resting place, life transformed again and again. The earth, now stable enough to preserve its own stories, began carving its memory into the layers of its surface. Shells accumulated in young seafloors, their shapes preserved, as if waiting for a future eye to uncover them. Forests collapsed under their own weight, transforming into coal that held the faint syntax of ancient vegetation. Creatures with bones left those bones pressed into sediment, a kind of script the earth finally learned to write. But deeper down, beneath the weight of eras, the earlier species slept on, hidden in a thickness of time, too dense for fossils. What remained of them was not shape or form, but an echo, a geological breath, unchanged by the turbulence above. Their presence became part of the slow tectonic heartbeat of the earth. Heat passed around their strata, like blood coursing through a deep organ. Pressure shifted above them, in waves so faint that each shift took millions of years to complete a single gesture. Yet nothing reached them, nothing disturbed the stillness. Where they rested, they were protected by the very depth that had erased them. The world had moved on in loud, dramatic cycles of life and death, but the quiet layers below held something gentler, a remnant of intelligence, born of harmony, not hunger. It is tempting to imagine that this gentle presence lingered as more than heat, more than pressure, perhaps as a pattern, a subtle alignment. In the mineral structure of stone, a faint echo that influenced the world in ways too soft to measure. Not a guide, not a guardian, just a warmth, a memory of balance woven into the crust, like a forgotten lullaby. Somewhere above them, the world entered an age where vast creatures roamed, their footsteps shaking the ground that held the quiet trace of a species long vanished. These creatures roared, claimed the land, left fossils scattered across continents. The earlier species never walked, but the stone beneath remained unchanged, a silent guardian of a forgotten time, when firestorms swept forests into charcoal black memory, when seas receded and exposed plains that glittered with ancient bones, when night skies filled with meteors bright enough to reset evolution's clock. The depths did not stir. What slept there slept without dreams. The earth was learning a new rhythm, a rhythm of destruction and renewal, of loss that made room for forms bolder than anything that had come before. The earlier species had not known this rhythm. Their world had been softer, more predictable, its changes gentle enough to nurture a mind that resonated rather than resisted. Now the planet was sculpting life that could endure in ways they never could. Life with bodies built for struggle and minds shaped by adaptation. Still, at the deepest layers, silence remained, unbroken, unquestioning, patient. That silence carried a kind of truth, a truth the earth itself did not speak aloud. That intelligence is not a single story, but a cycle, a pattern, a possibility that rises when conditions allow and sleeps when the world becomes too heavy for thought. In their long sleep, the earlier species became part of this pattern, the quiet reminder that the earth had been intelligent once, in a way that left no trace, but warmth. This warmth drifted upward in faint waves whenever pressure changed, so faint that it never reached the surface, never warmed the air, never shaped a climate, but it lingered, like the memory of a hand resting on stone. Even the planet could not fully erase what it had held so gently. The ages passed, some filled with towering creatures, others with small, persistent forms that would one day shape the fate of an entire world. Yet through extinction after extinction, through upheaval after upheaval, the earlier species remained, deep in their cradle, unchanged. The earth had carried them into an era they could never witness, an era that moved toward minds that would carve tools, shape fire, navigate seas, and eventually wonder what came before them. Those future minds would never find traces of the earlier species, in bone or artifact, but something of them, their softness, their way of listening, remained folded into the planet like the faintest memory of a dream the earth once had and buried without forgetting. There came a time deep in the planet's Middle Ages when the earth seemed to quiet itself beneath the weight of countless forgotten eras, not the quiet of stillness, for nothing in the world is ever truly still, but the quiet of acceptance, a long settling, a long exhale after ages of upheaval. Mountains rested in their new shapes. Forests rose and decayed in slow cycles that no longer shook the climate. Oceans deepened into their basins, finding temperatures that remained steady for thousands upon thousands of years. It was during this stretch of relative peace that the earlier species' remnants, buried far beneath the surface, began to feel the faintest release from the pressures above. Not enough to wake, not enough to rise, just enough to shift slightly in the stone, the way a thought sometimes stirs in the deepest sleep without reaching consciousness. Those subtle movements were not signs of life, but signs of memory, changing shape under pressure. What the earth held of them continued to evolve, not in complexity, but in depth. Their presence became less like warmth and more like a resonance, a pattern held in the arrangement of minerals, in the quiet alignment of crystals, in the deep geometry of metamorphic stone. Above them, the world was changing again. Creatures emerged that learned to dominate landscapes, shape ecosystems, influence climates with their presence alone. Forests thickened with the weight of new life. Wetlands expanded into labyrinths of reeds and still water. Insects rose into skies, in swarms so vast, the air darkened under their wings. But nothing in this rising complexity touched the deep layers, where the lost species slept, their world, once filled with warm rains and gentle climates, had been replaced by ecosystems that pulsed with hunger, competition, and survival. The gentleness of their era was gone, buried beneath time, so thorough that even imagination struggled to reach it. Still, somewhere in the planet's mantle roots, the faint warmth persisted, not the warmth of bodies, but the warmth of presence, the warmth a place remembers after a living thing has long left it. It clung to the grains of certain rocks, to the faint chemical traces left behind by forests that once sheltered them, to the pressure signatures in stone that formed under climates no longer found on Earth. This warmth moved slowly as the mantle convected, as plates glided over one another, as continents drifted inch by inch across the changing world. Sometimes deep earthquakes sent vibrations through the layers where they rested. These tremors stirred old patterns, releasing faint pulses that travelled upward like forgotten signals, trying to reach the surface. But long before those pulses emerged into light, they dissipated into the broader noise of the earth. Nothing reached the living world above. Not their story, not their silence, not the echo of their intelligence. What remained was simply the knowing that something once was, a knowing held only by the deepest parts of the planet. During these ages, ice sheets rose and fell, carving continents into shapes the earlier species would not have recognized. Rivers cut new paths through valleys that stood upon rock, older than the last memory of their existence. Coastlines shifted with such precision that future life would depend entirely on their new outlines. Life diversified, predators sharpened, prey adapted, ecosystems grew intricate beyond anything the earlier species would have imagined. And in the far depths, their presence softened further, not diminishing, but blending into the earth so completely that the planet itself seemed to carry a forgotten tenderness within its vast, indifferent processes. Even as the world grew harsher, more complex, more diverse, this hidden tenderness remained, a trace of a species that once moved not through dominance, but through resonance. It lived not in memory, but in the quality of certain silences that settled over ancient plains before storms, silences that lingered at dawn in cold valleys. Untouched by wind, silences found in caverns so deep that echoes refuse to return. The earlier species had left no fossils, no artifacts, no histories, but they had left contrasts, softness in a world that grew increasingly defined by sharpness, warmth in a world that learned to survive through cold cycles, quiet in a world that would soon erupt with voices of creatures that shaped environments with their will. Their long sleep was not a waiting, it was a merging, a joining with the slow pulse of the Earth's interior. And though no future species would ever find them, their presence continued to echo softly through the deepest layers of stone, a lullaby. The planet did not remember learning, but never entirely forgot. In the deepest quiet beneath the continents, where pressure reshapes minerals into forms older than memory, the faint echo of the earlier species settled into a stillness that no passing era could disturb. The Earth had not forgotten them, but neither did it remember. Their presence became something else, neither story nor symbol, neither life nor absence, just a silence woven into the foundation of things. Above them, the world continued its cycling of ages, warm epochs thick with forests, cold epochs carved by slow, deliberate ice. Species rose in waves, each one carrying a new interpretation of what it meant to live. Some left shells in the mud, Some left bones in the dust. Some left nothing but a brief light in the woven fabric of ecosystems. None of them touched the deep layers where the lost species rested. The earlier species, born from warmth, erased by change, buried by motion, remained intact, only as a resonance in the stone that held them. Their intelligence dissolved into the planet, like a soft memory pressed between pages of a book that continued long after its first chapter had closed. As continents shifted into their modern positions, the world settled into a structure capable of holding more permanent stories. Bones lasted, footprints hardened, climates slowed their wandering just enough to become knowable. But the gentler intelligence that came before was sealed so deeply that even the earth stopped touching its echoes. Their resting place became a sanctuary no era could intrude upon, a place where times collided and folded and merged into a single quiet certainty, a certainty that something once lived in harmony with the world's earliest breath, something once listened to the warm rains that no longer fall, something once dissolved so gently that the earth learned tenderness long before it learned permanence. And though no surface creature would ever sense them, the planet carried the softness of their vanished presence, like a hidden warmth beneath cold stone. Sometimes, in the moment before dawn touches ancient mountains, a subtle hush settles over the landscape, a hush that feels like the world preparing to remember something it never fully knew. That hush is their last gift, the final trace of Earth's first quiet children. Their long sleep was not an ending, it was the space that allowed new beginnings, a silence that made room for the next intelligence that would rise upon the cooling world. And somewhere deep within the planet's mantle, their warmth remains, faint, unspoken, carried forward, as time prepares to shift again. For what the earth buries, it does not discard, it folds into deeper layers, waiting for the moment when another story is ready to take shape above the sleeping past. The world had shifted through ages of ice and fire, through forests rising and dissolving, through oceans opening like great, slow thoughts. And in the long quiet beneath these changing surfaces, something new began to stir, not in the deep layers where the earlier species rested, but in the soft, fragile places where light first touched land. It did not happen suddenly. No awakening ever does. It began as a trembling in the fabric of life, a small widening of awareness, a faint sharpening of instinct, a subtle stirring that passed from one generation to the next, like a whisper carried on the breath of evolution. This new species, whoever they would one day become, did not rise from memory. They rose from hunger, from seasons, from cold winds that demanded thought. Sharper than instinct, they rose from the harshness the earlier species never knew, a world shaped by competition, by change, by the necessity to endure rather than harmonize. And yet, within their earliest stirring of mind, there was something soft, something unaccounted for, something that did not belong to a world carved by struggle, a strangeness, a quiet ache, a longing. No fossil explains such a feeling. No ancient bone carries its weight. But something in this newborn intelligence felt older than itself, a sense of familiarity in landscapes it had never seen, a faint recognition in dawn light falling across stone. They were new, entirely new, a mind shaped by a sharper earth. But in their earliest thoughts, those fragile sparks that hovered just above instinct was the softest echo of something forgotten, not knowledge. Knowledge leaves marks. This was gentler, a longing without origin, a feeling without memory, a grief without cause. It was the ache of a world that had dreamed before. As the species slowly awakened, their awareness widened, like a tide filling an empty bay. They began to recognize patterns in wind, movements of prey, shifts in the seasons. Thought formed not from harmony, but from necessity. And yet, between those necessities, between the hunger and the cold, and the careful watching of predators. There were moments when they paused and listened to something they did not understand, a silence that felt inhabited, a stillness that felt familiar, a warmth in stone that seemed older than sunlight. They did not know that deep beneath them lay the soft remains of a species the earth had once held gently, but something in their awakening seemed to sense that intelligence was not new here, that the ground beneath their feet had carried awareness before, not clearly, not consciously, just enough to pull at the edges of their mind, like the memory of a dream that slips away upon waking, but leaves behind its emotional weight. In this early awakening, their minds opened slowly, like petals unfolding in cold dawn. They learned to shape sound, to share warnings, to carve meaning from the chaos of the world. Their intelligence was rough at first, fragmented, clumsy in its attempts to grasp the world. But within that clumsiness was a flicker of gentleness, a quiet recognition of beauty in things that held no immediate use. Mountains glowing at sunset, the hush before snowfall, the rhythm of water touching stone. This recognition did not come from their world. Their world was harsh, unforgiving, demanding. The earlier species had sensed the world, through warmth, through resonance, through climates that no longer existed. And perhaps, in ways beyond science, the earth carried just enough of their vanished tenderness for this new mind to feel it without knowing why, not as memory, but as longing, a longing for something no longer present, a longing they would mistake for spirituality, for curiosity, for the need to understand a world that felt deeper than its surfaces, a longing that would one day push them to look at old stones and wonder what came before. The earlier species did not awaken within them. They did not pass knowledge. They did not pass language. But they passed an ache, a quiet, inherited ache that drifted into the new species through the very earth itself, an ache shaped like a question, older than minds. Has this world dreamed before? The awakening continued, slow, fragile, a flicker that would one day become a flame, and beneath it all, beneath the footsteps of this rising species, the ancient warmth persisted, silent, buried, waiting. Their awakening was not a revolution, it was a murmur, a faint stirring in creatures who had not yet learned the weight of thought. They lived close to the ground, breathing in the scent of cold grasses and damp soil. Their hands were tools, only in possibility, not yet in purpose. Their eyes traced the horizon without understanding that they were searching, and yet, somewhere in the quiet space, between instinct and awareness, something began to shift. At first it felt like restlessness, a discomfort with the familiar paths, a curiosity toward shapes they could not name. They followed rivers, not only for water, but for the strange pull of moving sound. They lingered at dawn, as if waiting for something the light had not yet revealed. Even before they understood the world, they felt an ache for it, not a need, but a longing that reached beyond survival, beyond the cold nights and the difficulty of finding food, a longing older than themselves, older than their species, born from a planet that had carried intelligence once and allowed the faintest echo of that gentleness to seep into the world again. They did not know it, but the earth beneath them held a residue of an older mind, soft, quiet, dissolved into mineral warmth and pressure folds, so deep they would never be found. But impressions do not need to be seen, to be felt. In certain valleys, the air carried a hush that settled over them, with strange comfort. On certain stones, the sunlight held an unexplainable tenderness, a warmth that felt familiar for no reason at all. And when rain fell, even the harsh, cold rains of their difficult world, something in their minds felt a pull toward a softness they could not name. They were animals, but something in them was waking. It began with attention, not attention to danger, but attention to beauty. A strange thing, an unnecessary thing. They paused at rivers, simply to watch water move. They stared at clouds, long after the threat of weather had passed. They traced patterns in mud, with absent hands, not knowing. They were shaping symbols. The earth itself had forgotten how to read. No creature had done this, in ages, not since the earlier species moved in harmony with ancient cycles. But the new species did not move in harmony. They moved in longing. The earth had changed, become colder, harsher, less predictable. To survive, this rising species had to think differently. They had to problem solve, adapt, predict. But outside those necessities, in the spaces between hunger and fear, their minds reached for something deeper. A quiet pull, a soft ache, a whisper in the stone that spoke of a world before struggle. It was not memory. No memory of the earlier species remained in the surface world. But the longing was real, a longing shaped by the Earth's own history, by the faint warmth left behind in stone, by the delicate impression of a species that once listened to the world with complete tenderness. This longing became part of their evolution. They began searching in ways no creature had ever searched, not only for survival, but for meaning. They followed distant horizons, with no promise of food or shelter. They climbed high ridges to watch storms gather, not out of fear, but fascination. They gathered around fire, not only for warmth, but for the mystery of light. With these small wonders, their minds deepened. Awareness became curiosity. Curiosity became thought. Thought became question. In their questions, they touched the faint echo of the earlier species. Not consciously, but emotionally. An ache with no memory attached. A sense that something had come before. A feeling that the earth had dreamed long before they did. They did not know the question. They did not know the answer. But the pull toward mystery became part of them. A quiet inheritance carried through the very ground. They walked on. Sometimes, in moments of stillness, they lifted their eyes to the sky with an expression no animal had worn before. A softness, a wondering, a recognition of something they had never known. That recognition was the first spark of mind. And beneath their feet, deep in the earth's oldest layers, the warmth of a vanished species remained folded in silence, waiting for someone to feel the ache and listen. The awakening of this new species deepened in quiet increments. Not leaps, not revolutions, but soft expansions of awareness that stretched across generations, like dawns spreading slowly over a long horizon. They began to understand that the world was larger than the immediate urgencies of hunger and cold. They sensed patterns in wind and water, in seasons and shadows. They learned the language of survival. But behind that language, something else was forming, something the earth had not held since the earlier species dissolved into its deep, warm layers. They began to feel the ache of wonder. It arrived first as restlessness, a desire to see what lay beyond familiar valleys, beyond the curve of rivers they had crossed 100 times. No instinct commanded it. No survival need prompted it. Yet they moved outward anyway, not fleeing, but seeking. What were they seeking? They could not have answered. But the earth knew. Somewhere deep in its crust, it still carried the residue of minds that once lived, in perfect resonance with it. The earlier species' tenderness had left no fossils, no bones, no artifacts, but it had left an echo, a quiet pressure in the unseen depths that shaped the world, the way memory shapes emotion. The new species felt this echo without hearing it. They felt it as a pull toward still places, toward the hush of early morning light, toward the soft edges of landscapes that held the last warmth of forgotten ages. Sometimes, in their wandering, they paused, for no practical reason, simply to look at the curve of distant mountains glowing under dusk, to look at the hush between raindrops, to look at the shadows moving across the ground, as if tracing the world's forgotten pulse. This looking was the beginning of imagination. It was the moment when survival alone stopped being enough. The moment when they sensed the world was not simply a place to endure, but a place with depth, with layers, with a quiet ache beneath its surfaces. An ache they did not understand, but felt drawn toward, as if listening for a story. Their bones could not recall, but their minds could almost touch. Their intelligence unfurled slowly. They began to share sound, not just warning cries, but syllables shaped by curiosity. They gathered around fire, not only for warmth, but to watch the dance of light and shadow, as if waiting for the flames to reveal answers they didn't know they were asking. In these small gatherings, their awakening took its first true breath. It was a breath the earth had felt before. Not this sharp, adaptive mind, but the soft intelligence of the earlier species who once listened to the world's young rhythms with quiet reverence. The two minds were nothing alike. One shaped by gentleness, one shaped by struggle, yet both paused before mystery. Both looked toward dawn with a sense that the world held something just beyond reach, something vast, unspoken and familiar. The new species did not know why certain places felt sacred. Long before they invented the idea of sacred, they did not know why the oldest stones felt warmer at sunset than the newer ones. They did not know why rain falling on certain cliffs carried a resonance that made them stop and listen with a quiet born from another age. The truth was simple. The earth had been intelligent once, and though it had buried that intelligence deep beneath kilometers of stone, a faint impression remained. Not memory, not knowledge, but longing. It drifted upward, through the layers of time, not as fact, but as feeling. And this feeling touched the new species, the way distant music touches a listener who cannot name the melody, but feels its emotion as if it were their own. As they grew in number, in skill, in awareness, their minds carried this ache forward, the same ache that would one day lead them to carve symbols, to paint stone, to stare at the night sky, and wonder what had once been. It was the ache that led them to imagine stories, to ask questions about beginnings, to feel shadows of meaning in places the earth itself had long forgotten. Their awakening was not just survival, it was remembrance, not of a story, but of a feeling carried across millions of years through stone and silence and slow geologic breath, a feeling that the world had dreamed before. And now, with this new mind rising, the earth felt the faint stirrings of awareness again. Not the same awareness, but the same longing, wearing a different shape. Their consciousness continued widening, not like the sudden blooming of a flower, but like a slow river, carving its way through stone, patiently, quietly, reshaping the world. By simply learning to see it, they learned to watch the stars, not for navigation, that meaning came much later, but because something in the night sky pulled at their thoughts, in ways no instinct could explain. The glittering cold above them felt both infinite and strangely familiar, as if echoing a memory the earth had long ago buried. When they gazed upward, they felt the faint shiver of an ancient ache, a longing, older than their species, older than their bodies, older even than the stone beneath their feet. They didn't understand it. They didn't need to. The longing itself was the message. During the day, they moved with purpose, gathering food, learning terrain, shaping tools, from stone and bone, with hands slowly discovering intention. But in the quiet moments, when the hunt was done, when the fire dimmed, when the sky deepened, their thoughts drifted towards silence. And in that silence, they met something they could not name, a presence without form, a memory without image, a tenderness that did not belong to their harsh world. Sometimes they felt it when touching warm stones at sunset, a heat that lingered, longer than the sun should have allowed. Sometimes they felt it, in the stillness before storms, a hush that made their hearts slow, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. And sometimes they felt it simply in the act of being alive, a strange aching awareness that life meant more than survival. They did not know that deep beneath them, beneath layers of ancient sediment and folded crust, the earlier species lay dissolved into a gentle pressure, a warmth the earth never fully released, but they felt its echo. All the same, this echo shaped them in ways invisible to bone or fossil. It shaped the way they paused, in places that held no food or shelter, but felt important nonetheless. It shaped the way they touched the ground, with reverence, long before reverence had a name. It shaped the earliest seeds of story. They began crafting meaning from the world, finding shape in clouds, finding omen in tracks, finding rhythm in the repetition of seasons. They invented patterns where none existed. They created myths before myths had structure, and in those myths the ache took form. They imagined spirits in trees that swayed in familiar ways. They imagined voices in rivers that murmured like memories. They imagined presence in mountains whose silhouettes seemed older than time. None of these imaginings came from knowledge, but from a longing that did not belong to them. The earth had carried the earlier species with such tenderness that the impression of that tenderness lingered. It seeped into soil, it softened certain winds, it remained in the chemistry of ancient stones. This new species, still raw, still learning, absorbed that echo without understanding what it was. They built their earliest rituals around places where the earth felt warmer, quieter, more ancestral. They sensed, without knowing, that the world beneath their feet held stories far older than their imagination. As their minds strengthened, they learned to remember, to shape the past into narrative, to pass knowledge from one generation to the next in murmured voices around flickering fire. But beneath all these stories, beneath the courage, the fear, the warnings, there was always the ache, a longing for something lost but never known, a longing that shaped their dreams with silhouettes of worlds that had never existed in their lifetime, a longing that made them look at the dawn with a sense of recognition that could not be explained. The earlier species did not live inside them. They did not whisper in their minds. They did not pass knowledge through stone. But the earth that shaped this new species had once carried intelligence and folded it into its deepest layers, and in ways the planet itself did not understand. Something of that first mind drifted upward, not as memory, but as yearning, a yearning that settled gently into the hearts of the species, now waking on the surface, shaping them into beings who longed to understand a world that always felt too familiar to be entirely new. As their minds continued to rise, slow as continents shifting, soft as dust gathering on untouched stone, the new species crossed a boundary that no creature before them had ever approached. They began to wonder not just what the world was, but why it felt the way it did. Why certain valleys felt like returning home even when they had never stood there before. Why certain patterns in the sky felt familiar as though painted from a memory not their own. Why certain winds carried a tenderness that did not match the harshness of their climate. Wonder became the quiet thread, pulling them through their earliest steps into true consciousness. They shaped tools, not only to survive, but to understand. They carved marks into wood and scratched symbols onto stone, not language yet, but something deeper, a reaching for meaning in a world that felt too full of silence to be empty. And that silence, that strange depth of quiet that fell over the land, in moments when the air stilled and time felt slower, that silence guided them. It was the closest thing the earth had left of the earlier species, an echo of resonance a softness in the world's edges, a warmth folded beneath stone. They didn't know this. They would never know. But the ache they felt, that inexplicable ache that seemed to swell in their chests when they looked at distant horizons or heard thunder roll across the hollows of night, was shaped by that buried presence. Life had moved on. Time had moved on. Continents had shifted. Species had risen and vanished. And yet, the impression of that ancient tenderness remained. It was the Earth's longest memory, though the planet itself did not realize it carried one. The new species felt this memory as longing. Longing became their compass. It pulled them toward places that felt meaningful, even when empty. It urged them to gather around fire, to share stories they did not yet understand, to look at darkness and imagine light within it. It urged them to look at one another and see not just bodies, but presences, souls, spirits, shadows, reflections of something they sensed but had never known. From this longing came empathy. From empathy came kinship. From kinship came the first fragile shape of humanity. The new species began walking upright, not simply to see farther or to free their hands, but because something in them was always searching for a horizon where longing might complete itself, searching for a story to match the ache, searching for a truth the earth did not speak aloud because it had forgotten the exact words. And yet, in the soft geometry of stone, in the lingering warmth of ancient minerals, in the strange stillness that falls just before dawn, the impression remained, a message without language, a presence without form, a dream without memory. They listened without knowing. They were listening. They followed intuition without knowing. The intuition was older than they were. They created meaning from landscapes shaped by ages that came long before them, and in doing so, they became something no creature had ever become. A species that sought not only life, but understanding. Understanding of the world, understanding of themselves, understanding of the ache that hummed just beneath thought. They began to bury their dead, not out of necessity, but out of sorrow, a sorrow that came from recognizing that life ends, yet something feels as though it shouldn't, a sorrow shaped by echoes of a species that had faded so gently the world never learned how to forget them. They began to carve symbols into cave walls, spirals, hands, animals, shapes that meant something they could not articulate, shapes that felt as if they were reaching towards something ancient, something buried, something the earth almost remembered. And when they sat by firelight, gazing into the sparks, rising like ephemeral stars, they felt the strange sensation of recognition, the feeling that the world had dreamed before and that they were waking into the residue of that forgotten dream. The earlier species was not reborn in them. Nothing returns unchanged. But longing passed forward. Longing became instinct. Instinct became imagination. Imagination became mind. And mind became the fragile lantern that would guide them through millions more years of searching. Searching for meaning. Searching for truth. Searching for a home that felt familiar because it once held a gentler intelligence. And so the world turned, slowly, deliberately, until this new species, fragile, curious, carrying an ache older than their bones, became the ones who finally asked what no creature before them had dared to wonder. They looked at the sky and felt familiarity. They touched ancient stone and felt tenderness. They watched firelight flicker and felt a story just beyond reach. A story the earth itself once held close. The earlier species did not return in them, but longing did. A longing folded quietly into the human heart. The strange ache that rises when we stare at night horizons, when we feel déjà vu in untouched places, when we sense meaning in the hush between lightning and thunder. A longing that is older than memory. Humans inherited, not their knowledge, not their voices, not their world, but their echo, a quiet impression left in the deep foundation of Earth, rising through millions of years, not as fact, but as feeling. A feeling that the planet has dreamed before, a feeling that life remembers more than it can say, a feeling that intelligence is not a single beginning, but a cycle, a tide flowing in and out across the continents of time. And perhaps when humans look upward and feel something stir, something warm, something strangely familiar, they are touching the faintest whisper of that older mind, carried across ages, by silence, by stone, by the slow turning of the earth, a whisper that asks, softly, gently, what if Earth once carried a mind before ours and simply forgot? The story ends here, not with an answer, but with an echo drifting back into the quiet breath of night, into the vastness of time, into the warm darkness, where all forgotten stories go. And now, wherever you are, however the night holds you, let the ache settle, let the stillness deepen, let the world fold around you like the gentlest memory. Close your eyes and rest. Let the earth dream again,